This year he will turn 55, and it is unclear whether that is a lot or a little. Probably, for an ordinary person, it is not much at all. But what is this man doing at his age? It seems that he is a failure. Right now, for example, he is in some kind of gorge and several hungry, bloodthirsty monsters are moving in his direction. These monsters won't even give him a break. And at his age, things don't come easily. He's not Superman, just an old man with a sword, but that doesn't matter to the monsters. And they don't care if he's famous or not. To them, he's just food. One of the goblins has grabbed the girl. She is bleeding and cannot help herself. In the last moments of her life, she looks with tear-filled eyes at the boy for whom she was the best friend, because he grew up in an orphanage without a family. The boy saw his teacher fall into the clutches of the monster and heard her last scream. A terrible fate befell not only the teacher, but also the other children with whom the boy grew up. They became a family to the child, but they all died, and the same fate was to befall the boy. Suddenly, a collapse appeared in the sky, and monsters descended to the ground. They were all different, but all predatory and eager to destroy humans. One by one, they took away all of the child's friends and loved ones. It was his turn to follow them, but suddenly something happened, and someone strong appeared next to the lonely, frightened child. The boy was afraid to move, because death was already breathing down his neck. But then his hero and savior appeared. The stranger smiled at the child and said that miracles happen and everything will be fine. Someone or something saved the boy at that moment, and he decided that from now on he would be the same. The boy grew up and dedicated his entire life to destroying monsters. Day by day, his strength grew as the boy became a young man and then a man, and more orcs died by his sword. However, no matter how many monsters he destroyed, the boy never became stronger. Many friends came to bury him, and each time it was very painful and tragic. Each time, the young man realized that he had failed to protect and save someone, and this killed him inside in its own way. And now, at such a serious age, the man felt that his body was beginning to fail him. Each battle was becoming more difficult and required more and more physical strength, and the monsters were becoming stronger and more dangerous. He had no dreams, no home, and no family. What was the life of this lonely warrior worth? The man considered himself a real failure and realized that soon he would not even be able to protect himself. Finally, he reached the point where he felt he was in deep shit. And here he was, again on one of his sweeps. A multitude of slain lizards lay behind him. The man plunged his sword into the head of yet another monster. He cleared the dungeon called the Ancient Dragon's Nest, but he was so tired and exhausted. Shin Sung-hyun was, of course, happy to complete another raid, but now he was pushing himself harder and harder each time. It had been more than 30 years since he became a swordsman, but so far his best achievement was that he had entered the top 100 warriors in his country. There were many players in the world, and Sang-hyun felt like a needle in a haystack. This time he received a skill book for clearing the dungeon. All these years he had been consuming artifacts, but now he looked at the book with interest, wondering if he could consume it. But suddenly the late dawn of a model student appeared before him. An unfamiliar man in a cloak and with a book in his hands was now standing next to Shin Sang-hyun. The late dawn student blessed him for his hard work and also rewarded him for his flawless final blow. Of course, it was nice to receive some bonuses from the contract group called the Exemplary Student of the Late Dawn. The warrior was now at level 650. As soon as he reached level 850, all the characteristics of the artifact and title would be doubled. However, due to these crazy conditions, the man could not reap the benefits, even though he now had such a good companion. Late dawn of the model student called for the artifact book to be consumed, so Shin Sang-hyun decided not to delay and do it right away. The player took the artifact and began to absorb it. It was the only skill the man had acquired when he awoke. To understand his skill in the first stage, Sang-hyun tried to cook artifacts over a fire. After that, he tried to fry them, thinking that the effect would be different when cooked, but there was no particular difference. Now the man had finished his pointless experiments. 30 years had passed. Shin Sang-hyun used mana synchronization every time he absorbed an artifact of the appropriate rank. He soon realized that this activated his artifact absorption skill, but he realized it too late. Other players were stronger, and many immediately awakened with great power. Shin Sang-hyun didn't have high hopes for significant changes this time either. The man thought there must be some kind of skill instruction, but nothing happened. His assistant claimed that very little was known about this skill, so he apologized for not being able to help any further. However, the assistant asked to compromise once more, as the man did not have much time left. Shin Sang-hyun began to synchronize his mana because he really felt that time was running out, as he was already too old and had too little strength left. If he had had a son back then, his son would already be a grown man, and Shin Sang-hyun himself could already be a grandfather and spend time with his grandchildren. The man understood that he should not be offended by his star curator because he had done nothing wrong. Sang-hyun felt that his whole life was nothing but regrets and disappointments. Shin Sang-hyun could not forget the back of the man who saved his life, and he spent his whole life trying to become like his savior. Now Sang-hyun was exhausted and devastated. He felt too old. If only he could be young again, he repeated this over and over, and his star curator sat silently, lost in thought. Shin Sang-hyun said he was retiring and that his curator needed to find another player for himself because their contract would be terminated. The star curator opened his book and did something. Everything around them lit up with bright colors, and this light surprised the player. The man looked at the constellation and couldn't understand what was happening. He felt extremely tired, and it seemed as if his body was beginning to melt away. The last thing he saw was his constellation, which gradually began to disappear. The late blossoming of a model student had disposed of the player he had been experimenting with. The reporter listened with interest to the awakened ones, talking about dungeons and all kinds of gates. The head of the Hunshan Corporation explained how players joined the community and explained that dungeons were steps for players. Gates are other dimensions, bordering on uncharted territories. These uncharted territories are places that players must explore and be pioneers in. Such an interview was broadcast on television. A player watched this program many years ago, but now it seems that time has truly turned back. The young man sat on the sofa, cleaning his sword and feeling confused. Although 4 days had passed, he began to gradually realize the changes that had happened to him. After the player lost consciousness, he woke up and found himself in his own apartment, where he had lived 30 years ago. The guy began to examine his body and realized that he was no longer a 55-year-old man, but a young 25-year-old guy with all his memories intact. Shin Sang-hyun thought about it a lot, trying to understand the reason why he had returned to the past. The only thing he clearly realized was that the constellation had performed a miracle for him. The guy was still puzzled, although he had gradually gotten used to it and realized that it didn't matter why he was here. Now, perhaps, it was time to go to work. The young man held a venom dagger in his hands, a basic bronze-level artifact that he had been lucky enough to acquire recently. This weapon was, of course, low-ranked, but it still had a hidden ability. Although the assimilation speed was low because the player had not used this weapon for a long time, the most important thing was its hidden ability. Soon, the young man began the process of synchronizing his mana with the venom dagger. Sanyan entered a state of unconsciousness, a special space that must be bypassed in order to consume the artifact. Each time it was very exciting, and it was impossible to know in advance what kind of dish would be created. Soon, a huge plate of grilled chicken appeared. A notification informed him that preparations for the absorption of the venomous dagger were complete. Sanyan was glad that this time the dish was completely normal. He was afraid that it would turn out to be something like centipedes from a wet swamp. Such an appetizing chicken could be eaten at any time, even without feeling particularly hungry. The absorption of the dagger was in progress. Upon its completion, a notification appeared about acquiring a dexterity bonus of +2. The young man received the hidden skill of Demon Strike. The venom dagger, which had been successfully absorbed, began to gradually disappear, and soon it was gone forever. It was a very useful skill. The young man not only gained additional abilities, but also satisfied his hunger. To some extent, it was a pity that the dagger was no longer there. However, a very useful skill had been obtained, as planned, and it was time to get ready for work. The huge gates were located on one of the city streets. It was a portal to the dungeon for the team of players. The players were preparing to clear it and were making their final preparations when suddenly the captain of the porters team addressed the captain of the players. The captain of the porters team reported that they had a new recruit who had joined just a few days ago. His name was Shin Sang-hyun. It turned out that this new recruit would immediately join the team of players. The captain of the porters was very surprised because the new recruit was supposed to join him first. Yoon Dae-hyun replied that he had already signed all the documents in the decree, so there should be no problem with that. The captain of the porters did not understand why this had happened, because the young man had only recently awakened and had not even graduated from the academy, and the players had never before added such members to their team. But the captain of the players said that everything had already been decided and that this issue was not up for discussion. The man said that he was keeping an eye on everything, including his group and the distribution of the contribution system, so it was not worth sticking his nose where it did not belong. The captain of the porters apologized and left. Yoon Dae-hyun didn't understand why he was so upset, and anyway, the porters had no say in the matter. But at that moment, another player asked his captain why he had accepted the newcomer, because it was truly irrational. The captain explained that if anyone died in this mop-up operation, it would be the newcomer, not the main members of the group. He would have to die, and then the porters would shut up, and there would be no losses among the group. Unfortunately, that would be the outcome, because everyone knew what a first-level player was capable of. He was a clever cat invented by the group's captain. Just then, a young, handsome, and determined young man named Shin Sang-hyun approached the players, introduced himself, and said that from that day on, he would be with them. The group of porters immediately disliked this newcomer, who had joined the main team and jumped over their heads. Sang-hyun felt that he had attracted everyone's attention. However, the guy did not expect anything else, although now everyone was staring at him too openly. Yoon Dae-hyun showed great hospitality and joy, and came out to personally greet the newcomer to his team, noting that the guy wasn't even late. The captain immediately noticed the guy's weapon, not even knowing how to comment on his choice. Sang-hyun said he used a longsword. The young man warned that he had watched a video on YouTube on how to use it. The captain explained that a longsword is one of the most difficult weapons to use on the battlefield, but the young man said he would at least try to defend himself. Yoon Dae-hyun noted that the guy had a fiery spirit, which was good because men should be brave. After the introductions were over, the captain of the group announced that it was time to start the raid. After that, the players took out their weapons and began to gradually enter the dungeon through the gate. The newcomer was told to stay at the exit as soon as he entered. The players entered the dungeon in high spirits. They joked with each other and estimated how many monsters they would be able to kill today. The group's captain looked at the newcomer and, remembering his words about the YouTube video, realized that this idiot had no idea what a dungeon was like. Of course, the young man looked very confident. This was because he had only recently awakened and immediately became a player, so now he thought he could handle anything. The group leader came up with a strategy for clearing the dungeon, and it turned out that the orc dungeon was the last resort for newbies. Yoon Dae-hyun was sure that the newbie would soon realize this himself. Finally, the captain entered the gate and immediately realized that things were bad, because what he saw was beyond comprehension. Right at the entrance to the dungeon, there were traces of battle and the body of a slain goblin. Looking a little further into the depths, all the players saw a newcomer standing with his long sword over a pile of destroyed orcs. Orcs were monsters that appeared mainly in games, novels, and fantasy films. They were somewhat similar to humans, so it was expected that players would have their own preconceptions about them. Orcs seemed weak because they did not possess any particular power or fighting skills. Compared to other monsters, such as dragons, orcs were indeed weak, stupid, and cruel. Because of this, newbies who thought too highly of themselves immediately rushed into battle with orcs without really thinking things through. Players knew that orcs had fairly simple and primitive characteristics and rushed to attack them. Soon, novice players found themselves in a difficult situation and could no longer fight back. After all, orcs were very tall and powerful creatures, 1.5 times the size of a normal human. They possessed enormous physical strength and could destroy a human with one hand without resorting to any weapons. For this reason, sending a newbie into battle with the orcs was a one-way ticket, and the group of players gradually advanced deeper into the dungeon. One of the players told the newbie that they wouldn't treat him any differently just because he was new. The guy had to fend for himself. No one was going to protect him. The captain of the porters couldn't calm down because this newcomer had just awakened and immediately became a player. Shin Sang-hyun smiled a very sweet smile at everyone, promising to do his best. The players said that it wasn't enough to just try, but that he had to do really well. It was clear that the guy would try, but that might not be enough. Sung-hyun turned to the player and asked if he could fight on the front lines when they encountered a monster. But the player didn't have time to answer. A huge goblin monster with a giant axe appeared right behind the players. Sang-hyun looked at the orc with excitement, as it was his first battle since his return. The guy said he would take care of the orc. The monster had already struck with its axe, but the player managed to raise his shield. The player was clearly frightened. Although he was able to defend himself with his shield, he did not understand how this newbie was going to use his sword when he needed to act very quickly. Sang-hyun replied to the player that it wasn't necessary to save him, but this was taken as ingratitude. Instead of doing something, the newbie was just talking. At that moment, the goblin swung his terrible axe again, and the player was clearly about to die. Yoon Dae-hyun jumped in just in time and struck with his shield, knocking the orc off his feet. The captain looked at his subordinates and shouted at them that they should not be chatting and cooling off, but instead should urgently join the battle. The captain ordered his players to retreat. He would deal with this enemy himself. The orc was very powerful, and he was enraged by the sudden blow, so he struck back at the captain. Yoon Dae-hyun immediately counterattacked and stabbed his dagger straight into the heart of the huge monster. Yellow blood flowed from the orc's chest. All the members of the player team were delighted. They cheered for their captain, who had done an excellent job and pierced the monster's heart. The orc was still alive at this point. He growled viciously, his eyes glowing with hatred. Despite its injuries, the monster gathered all its strength and managed to rush at the player. The captain managed to jump out of the way, but it was clear that the situation was not easy. Yoon Dae-hyun, as the captain of the players, should have been at the highest level, but it seemed that he would not be able to cause significant damage to the monster at this point. The captain rushed into the attack again, intending to pierce the orc with his sword. And he succeeded again. The guy was fast and agile enough, and he plunged his sword into the enemy's body once more. This time, the orc was lying on his back in the middle of the dungeon, and everyone thought the captain had killed him. Yoon Dae-hyun was very pleased. He said it was no big deal and asked how his team was doing. The players, completely delighted with their captain, confirmed that they were all right and that it was entirely thanks to him. The captain was about to tell the team members that it was time to move on when suddenly a growling sound made all the players alert. A crowd of orcs was heading towards them. They were all different, but equally powerful and cruel. At the front was a particularly nasty-looking orc with a beard and long fangs, probably their leader. The players were in complete shock. They were very surprised to see that the orcs were carrying weapons, and everyone waited for the captain's orders. Yoon Dae-hyun clearly did not expect such a turn of events, and after thinking for a moment, announced that it would be better for the players to retreat for safety reasons. The man understood that he had barely managed to defeat one orc, and it was clearly not worth even trying to fight a crowd. Shin Sang-hyun broke the silence by asking if he could try to fight these monsters. The other members of the team thought they had misheard. Had this newbie lost his mind? He should have been left near the exit, and now the guy was talking complete nonsense. The captain, looking at the orcs, began to explain to the newcomer that, of course, it was good to show initiative. But the young man had only just awakened. Sang-hyun stopped listening to the captain drew his sword, and rushed to attack the group of orcs approaching down the corridor. The newbie ran up and cut the first orc in half with his longsword. The members of the team were in shock. They didn't understand what had just happened, because the newcomer had just dismembered an orc with his longsword. Sanyang told them not to worry. The cut was indeed not very even or clean, and it was all because the young man was still only at the first level. There was no time to waste on conversation, because the next orc was already approaching the players with hatred. Seeing the body of one of their comrades, the orcs went berserk and decided not to mess around, rushing as a crowd to attack the young man. Shin Sang-hyun knew that although he was at a low level, he had more than enough experience, and the young man gripped his longsword more tightly in his hands. He began to strike, cutting through the air with his blade. The young man was very skilled, and each movement of his sword was precise and successful. Over the years of his previous gaming career, he had killed a huge number of such monsters. The players were no longer going to run away. They began to realize that the newcomer was quite capable of killing all the orcs. Soon, the last orc stood before the young man. It was simply gigantic in size, well-armed, and protected by armor, shields, knee pads, and all sorts of other equipment. However, all this did not help him. The orc was heavy and slow, and soon San-hyun managed to get close and cut the monster's skin with his long sword. The captain shouted that this orc had too thick skin, and that such an attack would not work against him. Things were looking bad. The monster remained very strong and swung his axe, not letting his opponent get close. However, the rookie was completely calm and focused on the fight. He asked his comrades not to panic. San-hyun used the Demon Strike skill against his opponent. The monster's body began to tremble, and it could no longer move properly because the Demon Strike created strong interference. San-hyun saw that his skill had taken effect, and now he could calmly use this small window of opportunity to launch an attack. His longsword was long enough and very sharp, and now the carcass of a huge orc lay chopped up in front of the group of players. All the guys, including the player's captain, didn't understand what they had just seen. Everyone knew that this newbie had only awakened a few days ago, but this guy had a skill that caused interference, and he was able to use it. The skill was very powerful. It wasn't just ultra-short interference, but something much more serious. The players thought the rookie was too experienced and used the long sword as if he had done it before. Everyone immediately wanted to watch the YouTube video the guy had mentioned. Yoon Da-hyun was just as amazed as the other players. He had never seen interference used against an armed orc before. And this was done by a young man who had awakened only a few days ago. Where could he have gotten this skill? At that moment, Shin Sang-hyun received a notification that his level had increased. It didn't matter what level he was now, but he had gained the skill of evasion, and that was really nice. After that, the guy had to choose a skill or characteristic that could be increased. Sang-hyun immediately began to increase his luck. It was too late in his previous life that he realized the importance of this characteristic, because luck is directly related to the frequency of artifacts appearing. Yoon Da-hyun approached the young man and asked if he was really Sang-hyun. The captain wanted to know the name of the skill the guy was using and where he got it. Of course, he could have told him about his past life, many years of daily battles, and his old man's experience, but that remained in the young man's head. He replied that he had acquired the skill upon awakening. The captain was furious. He thought the young man was trying to deceive him. The captain demanded that he not evade the question and tell him where he got the skill. But at that moment, the man's gaze fell on the guy's weapon. This strange long sword turned out to be not just a sword, but a diamond-level artifact. Shin Sang-hyun handed his weapon to the captain and said that he could check it himself if he wanted to. Yoon Da-hyun took the huge long sword and began to examine it. It was a faded two-handed sword, belonging to the category of ordinary artifacts. The captain made sure that he was holding a completely ordinary sword, and then it became unclear how the guy could kill orcs so easily with it. The captain was clearly upset because he had been exploring dungeons for 2 decades, but even he did not have such a cool skill. At that moment, one of the players caught the captain's attention, reporting that the middle boss had awakened. The captain of the players was still too preoccupied, but his team was waiting for orders and important decisions had to be made. Yoon Da-kyung said to the newbie that dealing with simple orcs was easy, but now it was time to stop crossing the line. In other words, the team captain was sure that the young man's skill would be useless in this situation, because now they would have to fight an orc demon. Sang-hyun, of course, couldn't tell the captain that there was a real reason why he had decided to join this particular squad immediately after his return. The guy turned to the players. He needed to tell them something urgently so that the circumstances would turn out in the best way for him. Sang-hyun asked the captain of the group if he could take the artifact for himself if he managed to defeat the orc demon. Everyone's eyes popped out of their heads when they heard this, but the young man continued to smile, explaining that he really wanted to get the artifact that was given for killing such an orc. The fact was that in this team, each player was paid for their personal achievements in battle. The artifact that could only be obtained by killing an orc dragon was called the Crimson Stone. Even after defeating 100 demon orcs, it was difficult to obtain, and the chances of it dropping were always negligible. However, in his past life, Sang-hyun's team had been in this dungeon and unfortunately had failed to defeat the orc demon. But they were lucky enough to see the Crimson Stone at the moment when another team obtained the artifact, and Sang-hyun, exhausted, simply watched it happen. The players congratulated their captain, asking how he managed to get the Crimson Stone. The players planned to make a lot of money by selling this artifact because It was one of the few that could activate the delay skill. San Young looked at the players with admiration. It was the first time he had heard about the delay skill, which he desperately needed. And now the young man had the opportunity to get this artifact. All that remained was for the team members, or more precisely the captain, to allow him to do so. Sang Hyun knew that this team paid according to contribution, so if he personally defeated the monster, there should be no problem with the distribution of the reward. Yoon Da-hyun understood that this insolent young man was up to something. He was no longer sure that the newcomer was a weakling, but he didn't want to give up the valuable artifact. The other team members thought the guy was just crazy and didn't take him seriously. He clearly thought he was super smart, even though he had only killed a few primitive orcs. Sanyan really needed the delay skill, which could be very useful to him in the future, so he didn't react to the rudeness of the other players. The team captain calmed the guys down, saying that they shouldn't pick on the new guy, and then allowed Sang Hyun to do what he wanted. Captain Yu added that the young man would only get to fight the demon orc if the main team couldn't handle it. The captain was very serious and reiterated that the newcomer would be able to go into the dungeon and kill the monster on his own if the team couldn't do it. Sang Hyun realized that he didn't need to participate in this battle, and to be honest, that's what he was hoping for. But he didn't expect it to be so easy. Captain Yoon told the guy to keep himself busy while they were fighting and went to the battle site with the team members. The captain was clearly furious, feeling humiliated that this rookie had gotten cocky with only one skill. The captain decided to do his utmost to clear the dungeon and leave Sanyeon without the desired artifact. The captain was sure that experience was the most important thing on the battlefield. The man walked up to the doors leading to the part of the dungeon where the orc boss was and opened the door. In the depths of the hall stood a huge monster with a giant axe in its hands, and a bright crimson stone glowed in its chest. The middle boss of this dungeon was a bloodthirsty orc demon, and he looked truly demonic. Horns curled like a ram's, huge long teeth, a body entwined with chains, and an artifact shining in the middle of his chest. Captain Yoon ordered the players to prepare, and the men examined the monster, figuring out how they would fight it. The orc demon looked terrifying, but in principle it was not difficult to defeat. The captain ordered his men to surround the enemy and attack. The captain wanted most of all to prove to Sanyeon that teamwork was important in everything, especially here, where survival was essential. A group of players, armed with their weapons and led by the captain, rushed to attack the orc demon. The next moment, Captain Yoon found himself lying on the ground, his face covered in blood, barely able to breathe. The man did not understand what had happened to him. He looked as if he could not orient himself in space. Shin Sang-hyun watched the battle from the sidelines, and at one point he even got scared when the players all rushed together to attack the monster. Sang-hyun remembered that his group had behaved in exactly the same way in his previous life and lost the battle. The team members turned to their captain with questions about what to do next. No one wanted to die. Sang-hyun looked at the orc demon and realized that this orc and his previous enemy were very strong, and the young man became convinced that it was not worth listening to advice from YouTube. Captain Yoon shouted at his team members to retreat because there was no need to defeat the monster today. Sang-hyun smiled happily, and the players couldn't understand what was wrong with him because it was already clear that this was no ordinary orc. But the captain didn't want to engage in long conversations while near the demon orc, and once again ordered all the players to retreat. The players listened to their captain's orders with relief. They didn't want to die, even though it was only a mid-level boss. Captain Yan immediately warned the newbie not to be offended when he was wounded and felt death approaching. Shin Sang-hyun took this as permission to kill the orc demon, took out his sword and said that he would not die today. By this time, the orc had grown tired of waiting for the players to resolve their internal issues, so he grabbed his axe and rushed into the attack. Sang-hyun knew that if he compared only his stats to those of the orc demon, the young man had absolutely no chance. But the guy had a wealth of experience from his past life, and he was going to use it. The young man jumped onto the monster's head in one leap. The players had already left the hall, and Captain Yoon heard the sound of a weapon falling onto the stone floor and froze. Could the newbie have knocked the axe out of the orc's hands? At that moment, Sang-hyun was shaking his tired hand. The guy understood that the only thing he could do was dodge the attacks of the orc demon. The mid-level boss was very angry, growling, and the crimson stone glowed brightly on his chest. Sang-hyun paid no attention to the monster. He saw before him the desired stone, which he had not encountered for a long time. The fact was that there were reasons for such obsession with this artifact. Sang-hyun possessed the Demon Strike skill, which when combined with the Delay skill, produced a special effect, although it was quite difficult to understand how to improve the stun. However, as the owner of the artifact Devouring skill, the young man could combine various skills, and this led him to think about the existence of an ability that would allow him to accumulate the stunning effects of the Demon Strike. It would be an ideal combination of skills, giving him infinite stun, and if Sang-hyun acquired the Delay skill, it would become a reality. He had to provoke the enemy into attacking, so the young man did not hide and did everything he could to make the orc want to destroy him. The demon orc did indeed rush to attack the player, and the young man moved excellently and quickly, but only inflicted minor blows. Of course, he couldn't hope that these cuts would prove fatal, but the guy could discover his opponent's weak spots. After that, the young man activated the Demon Strike skill, and it turned out that the orc demon was stunned for a while and completely inactive. Captain Yoon thought that some kind of malfunction had occurred because the delay skill could not work on mid-level bosses. Sang-hyun knew that orcs were very stupid, but his opponent was an orc demon. Sure enough, when the delay ended, the monster rushed to attack the guy, striking with its huge foot. Sang-hyun stuck his sword into the ground and, holding it with all his strength, parried the orc's blow. Sang-hyun completely forgot that in his past life, he had seen the regenerative abilities of demon orcs. Thanks to this ability, the stun effect was removed ahead of time. Sang-hyun had to wait a certain amount of time before he could use the stun effect again. That was why the young man needed the delay effect. If he couldn't stun his opponent, then he would have to defeat him in another way. The demon orc attacked again, but the young man managed to jump out of the way, and the monster's huge axe stuck into the floor. The players watched this battle as if they were in a computer game. It all looked simply unreal. The guys felt that they needed to retreat urgently, because even this novice couldn't cope with the orc demon. Everyone noticed that the stunning skill didn't work, and there was a huge difference in stats. However, the happy expression on the guy's face puzzled all the players. They thought he was losing. But at that moment, Sang-hyun decided it was time to end the battle. He had already been through this once in his past life. If the guy was weaker than his opponent, he had to focus all his strength on one thing and completely forget about cutting down the enemy. Instead, he had to use his opponent's strength against him. And just then, another attack from the monster came. Sang-hyun decided that it was the perfect time to pierce the monster. The young man thrust his sharp, long sword into the orc demon's axe, and it began to crumble into small pieces right before his eyes. Sang-hyun thrust his long sword deeper, and now the weapon was deep in the monster's heart. Immediately, a notification appeared stating that the young man had defeated the mid-level boss. The young man immediately received several level-ups and was now considered a demon hunter. Sang-hyun was very pleased because he had already won 2 titles. And of course, this meant that he was better off fighting without a team. Soon, the other players approached the young man, unable to find the words to comment on what they had seen. Sang-hyun understood that he needed to come up with some kind of explanation to avoid awkward situations like this. The young man grabbed his thigh and began to moan loudly and shout that he had almost died, and that he didn't know what he would have done without the captain, who had inflicted all the damage on the orc demon. The team players said that this was exactly what they thought, because it was their captain, Yoon, who had participated in the battle. Captain Yoon was a bit slow on the uptake, and at first couldn't understand what the players were talking about. Sang-hyun looked at the captain, hoping that he wasn't completely stupid, because he had been given a chance not to lose his honor. Yoon Da-hyun didn't comment, but his gaze fell on the gorgeous artifact that appeared after the middle boss was killed. Sang-hyun hoped that the captain of the players would keep his word regarding the artifact. Captain Yoon finally snapped out of his stupor and announced to all the players that after defeating the middle boss, it was time to prepare for the final boss. The captain led his team, and the guys thought that the newbie was really very weak and would never have been able to do it on his own. Of course, everyone wanted to have the stun skill, but in the end, this skill turned out to be completely useless. Sang-hyun waited until everyone had left the room to take the artifact for himself. The young man looked at the cremstone and thought he could swallow it right now. The young man fell into a state of unconsciousness where he could absorb artifacts. The cremstone appeared to him in the form of noodles with meat and sauce. The guy began to eat the dish with pleasure, thinking that he was lucky again because it was impossible to resist such a delicacy. The process of absorbing the artifact was almost complete when a notification arrived about the delay effect. Sang-hyun did not understand why he felt so excited, but now the young man could add the delay effect to his skills. The guy immediately applied the delay effect to the demon's blow, and now he could use the stun several times in a row. However, with each strike, its power and duration decreased, but it was still great, as Sang-hyun received a guaranteed 4-second stun. Of course, it was a bit weak, but it was quite possible that with such a skill, he would be able to fight well. Yoon Da-hyun approached the player and asked if they could have a heart-to-heart talk. The team captain said that they were now in front of the final boss room, and an orc demon awaited them behind it. Captain Yoon didn't want the young man to join the battle. He said he couldn't be a leader as captain if there was such a strong player in his squad. Captain Yoon reached out to the newcomer and offered to work together, and Sang-hyun agreed. However, he reminded him that his demands were still the same. The young man wanted to take the artifacts he earned himself. The player came to report to the captain that the group was ready and noticed the guys shaking hands. Captain Yoon confirmed that the players were about to launch an attack and that everyone needed to get ready. But the player, who had always been the captain's closest friend and assistant, began to feel jealous. Captain Yoon was in a great mood. He told his guys that this was the last battle, and after it, he suggested that everyone go to a cafe and have a drink. Soon the players reached the final boss room. It was a huge stone hall with a terrifying monster in the center. The orc demon literally exuded hatred. It was huge, powerful, and very muscular. It was a berserker. Captain Yoon said that he and the fighters would go first, and that Sang-hyun would not intervene in the battle for now. However, the rookie stepped forward and, saying that all the players should stay close to him, the young man took out his longsword. Sang-hyun knew that berserk orcs had lower resistance than ordinary demon orcs, so it would be easier to stun him. The young man decided to calmly attack the berserker after stunning him and believed that there should be no problems. But at that moment, the boss himself rushed into the attack, opening his huge mouth. In one hand, he held a club, in the other, a spiked metal ball. San Young felt confident. Never before had he participated in a battle with such a wonderful feeling. When he was younger, he was afraid of absolutely everything and started out not as a player, but as a regular porter. Years passed, and the man simply tried to survive. Every time he tried to join a team of players, he was rejected because his skill level was too low. But now Sang Hyun couldn't be the same. He had to completely change himself. Sang Hyun did not want to repeat his past mistakes and was determined to build a better future. To do this, he had to show and prove to everyone, and first and foremost to himself, what he was capable of. The entire team of players gathered near the entrance to the hall, watching as the young man dodged the orc's attacks. At that moment, the young man was able to jump closer and cut through his opponent's body with his long sword, purple blood spurting in all directions. San Young shouted to his comrades that the orc would be stunned for 4 seconds. The players immediately rushed into the attack as a group, led by their captain. The guys did a great job, each dealing minor damage, but in total it was enough. The final boss of the room, the orc berserker, was defeated, and now the monster lay in a pool of its own blood. The players felt cheated. It had all happened too easily. Of course, they understood that this was due to the stun effect. The guys from the porter team had already begun to decide among themselves who would be the personal porter for this miracle player. San Yun heard the conversations behind him and noted how quickly these guys had changed their tune and decided to become his friends, even though he had absolutely no intention of doing anything for them. At that moment, notifications about the level increase arrived, and now the young man had the title Unsurpassed in Strength. The young man noted that today he had a real harvest of titles, whereas in his previous life, he had never received a single one. All this was very pleasant, but the player understood that this level was not enough to become the player of his dreams. The strongest fencer in Korea with many titles, Do Kyung-soo, was a ghostly blade, a collector, and a perfect sword, all of which he achieved 2 years after joining the game. Yun-soo was his idol, and before the boy went back in time, he had already reached level 500. But now the young man felt that he could catch up with his idol if he worked hard. Sang Hyun was so lost in thought that he attracted the attention of the other guys, so he had to come up with an excuse that he was just warming up. Yoon Dae-hyun thanked his colleague for his good work and gave him a reward. It was an artifact. Sang Hyun did not expect this at all and asked the captain why he had suddenly given him a reward. Dae-chun replied that he knew how to be grateful, and besides, it was only a bronze-level artifact, so he could afford to be generous. The captain gave him the artifact because it was cheap. If it had been something expensive, he would have kept it for himself, but he simply hoped never to see Sang Hyun again. Captain Yoon regretted this, but he understood perfectly well that it would be better this way, as this young man was in a completely different world and was on an unattainable level. However, this action caused discontent among the player, who had long been the captain's right-hand man. The man decided that this was completely unfair. Full of hatred and jealousy, the man took out his phone and did something to ensure that the captain and his new favorite would die soon. After the dungeon was completely cleared, Shin Sang-hyun went home. The guy was in a great mood now, realizing why he had become a player, even though in his previous life he had worked as a porter for a long time. This good mood was the result of the amount of money he had earned. It seemed that the captain had deposited double the payment into the player's account, not to mention the bonus the guy received after clearing the dungeon. It was a berserker ring, a bronze artifact that provided a relief effect. Even though the ring was bronze level, it was nice to get the lightness effect for free. With this effect, it was possible to lighten the weight of weapons, but at a cost of 1 mana per second. Most players would run out of mana before they even lifted their swords. The young man understood all this thanks to his long past life, because it was then that he was able to study all the subtleties of his ability. In his past life, he used artifacts that required mana. In the end, the results greatly surprised the man. There were artifacts that required mana, and they received a penalty, but did not lose their mana cost. San Yun decided to immediately combine mana with the Berserker's ring. Now, with a large amount in his account, the guy wasn't worried about penalties, and the more skills he had, the easier it would be for him to earn large sums of money in the future. There was a special atmosphere in the city's nightclub. It was a private club for a select group of people. The red-haired player told the guys and girls that the insolent newbie really did have a 4-second stun. The man the guy was telling this to said that there was no need to raise his voice or behave aggressively. He was a huge, muscular guy who asked what the player wanted from him. The red-haired guy said that the newbie had money and was most likely using some kind of artifact related to stuns. However, the thug didn't understand what the redhead wanted from him. The redhead was too cowardly. He said he was just offering cooperation, but then another man interrupted the conversation. He was clearly interested in what he had heard, but the conversation immediately took a different turn because the red-haired player had his ear cut off. A very powerful and confident player held a glass of drink in one hand and a long sword in the other, with which he cut off the stranger's ear. The bandit said that they were not servants who would carry out his orders and demanded immediate payment if the stranger wanted to achieve anything. The bandit's appearance was memorable. He had 3 vertical scars in place of 1 eye. The man demanded to be paid the price of an ear and asked where to find the guy who needed to be dealt with. The training ground for players was located in a beautiful place. Shin Sang-hyun now spent a lot of time there to practice his new skills before going to the dungeon. The young man received cold cucumber soup from the berserker's ring. Of course, he ate it, but his stomach was still upset. Still, there was no need to be too upset because there were advantages to everything. Now the guy could easily wield a sword. He could toss it and spin it without feeling its weight. The sword became much lighter due to the lightning effect. Sanyan was always active. The guy decided to use a two-handed sword for now, fearing that he might accidentally let go of the weapon. After practicing one of the skills, the young man said that the situation was developing quite well and that he could move on to the next one. Sanyan carefully studied his indicators and stats and realized that he needed constellations. Since a player can only have one constellation, he needed to think carefully about this. If he could choose, he would choose someone who fits his best stat well. He would choose the constellation of luck. The young man understood that he currently lacked the stats to attract the attention of any constellation. The young man went to the training hall because that was the only thing he could do for now. He spent quite a lot of time there. After finishing his workout, the young man felt very tired and immediately drove away. Sang-hyun spent 3 days training hard and also spent a long time behind the wheel of a car, but it was worth it because he gained a new skill. The young man arrived at the gates of a dungeon designed for solo play. It was an exclusive dungeon. Other players wait a whole month in line to enter such a solo dungeon. Sang-hyun realized that he was lucky because he could pay for his solo mission and get in. Nearby in the bushes, the young man noticed a lone car. He didn't understand who could be following him through the forest. It was unclear what these pursuers wanted. But there was no point in lingering here because everything would be revealed inside the dungeon. A group of players passed through the gate into the solo dungeon. These were the very bandits hired to do the dirty work by a player from Captain Yoon's team. Of course, this dungeon was designed for a single player. That was the question that hung in the air. A lone young man sat in the depths of the room, his sword standing beside him. The guy assumed that the players must have made a mistake since they had entered a solo dungeon. Besides, it had been reserved for Sang-hyun. However, the guys did not answer the question. They were confident in their strength and looked at the young man with a smirk. Sang-hyun told the guys that they looked like an unusual team and suggested that they just leave, promising not to report their offenses. Sang-hyun carefully studied his opponents. He saw that there were no healers or mages among them. The players had abandoned the stability so necessary for every cleared dungeon and formed a squad consisting exclusively of swordsmen and archers. They were a squad hunting people. They were a pack of hyenas. The huge brute said that this kid thought he was a tough player, but if he died here, he wouldn't even have a chance to recover. Sang-hyun knew that in the past, these guys had been destroyed thanks to the constant supervision of the Players Association. In such groups, the most difficult thing to deal with is the archers. At that moment, the archer announced that they needed to finish quickly. Sang-hyun replied that he had been waiting for them on purpose. The young man said that this was indeed a very suitable place if you needed to get rid of some bodies. The bandits were furious when they heard this. The big guy was about to rush in, but the gang leader stopped him. The leader announced that they would take the easy way out. The dumb thug didn't understand what he meant by the easy way. He just wanted to rip out the insolent player's tongue. Sanyan called the thug an obedient dog who should listen to his master. Of course, the thug couldn't stand such an insult and immediately rushed to attack the player. Shin Sang-hyun was completely calm. He knew that the main motto of such a dungeon was survival of the fittest. Monsters always want to kill players in dungeons, but even if it's not monsters who want to kill you, the meaning remains the same. Sometimes it happens that other people want to kill the player. Often, a person becomes a victim of villains. If you are weak, you will die. When a player is inside a dungeon, there are no rules. It's either you or them. In his past life, Sang-hyun had exactly that experience. But now the young man was going to apply his knowledge to a younger age. So everything that happens in the dungeon is just self-defense. Sang-hyun took out his sword and cut the thug in half. He turned to the villains and said he didn't understand why they weren't attacking yet. The bandits seemed to snap out of their stupor. They immediately rushed away with their leader. The gang leader demanded that they keep their distance and ordered the archer to cover them while they took up their positions. The archer confirmed that he would do so, even though he was in shock. After all, he had just seen the giant cut in half before his eyes. The archer did not understand how this had happened. After all, this guy had only recently awakened, and perhaps he had already reached the 100th level. Sang-hyun stood in the middle of the room, spinning his sword on his fingers as if he felt no weight at all, and asked where his new comrades had run off to. At that moment, the archer took aim and shot at the player. But before his eyes, a miracle happened. The young man cut the arrows into pieces with his sword. After that, Sang-hyun threw his sword at the archer, and now the bandits realized that the stranger was not the naive simpleton he appeared to be. Sang-hyun rushed to chase the bandits. He was clearly excited, but they suddenly realized that the young man was completely unarmed. The boy's sword was stuck in the archer's chest. Sang-hyun tried to retrieve his weapon, while the bandits tried to prevent him and rushed to intercept him. The young man had just grabbed his sword when the bandits approached him and raised their swords, ready to punish the unknown player who had killed their comrades. One of the bandits swung his axe, confident that he would hit Sang-hyun. However, he simply cut down his colleague without even hitting his opponent. Sang-hyun held his sword by the hilt and hung over him in the air. the bandits realized they were dealing with a real psychopath. At that moment, the hand of the bandit leader named Yunta fell on the back of his comrade's head. The guy didn't even have time to figure out what his boss was doing when Yunta threw him at the attacking enemy. And now there were only 2 of them left. Sang-hyun believed that the bandits were, in fact, selling human organs. He was sure that the gangsters were united not because they trusted each other, but because they had a common goal: to collect mana stones through organ transplants. Sang-hyun understood that his appearance did not suggest that he had a lot of life experience. But it turned out that Sang-hyun's version was correct, and it didn't matter to the gangster where the young man knew all this from. The insolent man had to be destroyed so that he wouldn't talk. Junt brought his sword close to the young man's head, intending to kill him, but Sang-hyun activated the Demon Strike skill. As a result, the bandit froze for a moment and was stunned for a long enough period of time to take advantage of the situation. Junt understood that he had been stunned because the guy from Captain Yoon's team had told him about it. Junt remembered that he had received minor injuries, literally scratches, while holding his comrade's head, but it turned out that this was enough. Sang-hyun announced that it was all over. Junt couldn't believe his ears. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that he was going to die just like that, for no reason at all. After all, he was the kind of person who killed, not the kind who was killed. That's how it had been his whole life. He would ingratiate himself with weaker players who were just starting out, and then he killed them brutally, leaving them no choice. And even if the players begged for help and promised to do anything, it didn't help. Juntae was a typical predator who didn't need a reason to kill. But now, facing his own death, the bandit was clearly scared because he realized he was cornered. Sang-hyun washed the blood off his sword in the nearest river and thought that he didn't need to get used to this, because he had only recently become young again. Unfortunately, now the guy had little chance of signing a contract with the Constellation. Sang-hyun understood, of course, that it was merely self-defense on his part, but he had no choice but to act that way. Suddenly, the young man saw a whole pile of artifacts appear on the ground near him. The guy received a total of 8 artifacts after surviving the fall. It turned out that all these things now belonged to him alone. After cleaning his weapons and tidying himself up, the young man got dressed, straightened his clothes, and heard the sound of a message arriving. The guy began to study the information and checked that all his stats had increased. Of course, he would have liked to avoid the unpleasant situation that had happened to him, but the results were worth it. Sang-hyun noted that, judging purely by his stats, he was as strong as a level 50 player. It was amazing how quickly he had increased his strength after rejuvenation. It was nice to see that the growth was exponential. In addition, something fell out of the player's pocket. The young man took a restoration ring out of his pocket. It was a silver artifact that eliminated any deviations from status. The first thug who attacked Sang-hyun had possessed this artifact. It was surprising that such a player had an artifact to remove status anomalies. This meant that if the young man had relied solely on stunning, he would have lost today's battle with the bandits. He would have to be very careful next time. Sang-hyun immediately started the process of synchronizing his mana with the recovery ring. It was not worth putting off such important and useful things. Inside the dungeon was an underground road, and along it walked a group of orcs carrying their loot. Sang-hyun could finally start clearing the dungeon and went out to meet the orcs. The guy walked along the rails holding a sword with both hands. His eyes were covered with a black bandage. He was fulfilling the requirement to obtain the title Happy Day. According to this requirement, the player had to kill 500 enemies with his eyes closed. The orcs heard and saw the player approaching and turned toward him with discontented expressions. Sang-hyun couldn't attack because he couldn't see his opponents. He waited for their attack, hoping to destroy the orcs while defending himself. The young man felt the presence of the orcs, heard their wheezing and smacking. Sang-hyun knew that he needed to feel the flow of air and listen to it carefully. He had to focus on his senses and engage all his senses. Sang-hyun turned into one big ear, trying to hear the movement of the air. The young man was sure he would succeed. Finally, one of the orcs rushed to attack the boy, wheezing and growling, holding his axe in his hands. Sang-hyun waited for the right moment and swung his sword around him, cutting the orcs to pieces. After that, silence fell, and the young man realized that he had dealt with the first group of orcs. Sang-hyun was pleased with such a good start. It gave him hope that he would succeed, but then a shot rang out from somewhere in the distance, and he had to react instantly, which was difficult considering he was blindfolded. Sang-hyun was pleased with himself. He thought he was doing well so far because he managed to grab the arrow and break it in half. The orc archer was surprised. Even though he was stupid, he had never encountered such an opponent before. Sang-hyun explained to the orcs that he had recently found himself in a difficult situation, but thanks to that, he was able to indulge in memories from his past. This experience helped the young man hone his senses, but one way or another, he had to be as careful as possible now. Sang-hyun, of course, couldn't see that the entire dungeon was swarming with orcs behind the archer. Still, the young man turned to them and demanded that they attack. And indeed, a horde of orcs immediately rushed at the player, ready to tear him to pieces. The young man did an excellent job wielding his sword, and soon the entire dungeon was littered with the remains of orcs and their blood. The last surviving orc went to his comrades, and now Sang-hyun stood in the middle of a bloody mess. Information about a level up came in. The young man received the title Lucky Day and was able to remove the blindfold from his eyes. The guy didn't even feel that he had worked hard to earn this title. The title Happy Day had an interesting effect. When the young man defeated the same type of monsters, his luck stat increased. This was a good sign because a new group of orcs came around the corner. The orcs were very angry when they saw their comrades lying on the floor in pieces, like soup sets. Sanyong greeted the orcs with a satisfied smile. He decided to immediately use his new title as a chance to earn additional stats. There were no problems with completing this task, and the guy's luck level increased significantly. Sanghyun noticed that his luck level had increased by 30 points, all thanks to his new title. It was actually even better than most platinum stats. The young man continued to happily admire his new abilities when suddenly a red glow began to appear behind him. Sanghyun thought that in this life, he would be able to afford to buy a house. But then a notification came that his surroundings were beginning to blur. The young man did not expect this to happen so quickly. It turned out that 3 constellations were offering the player a contract: the Cleaner of the Fallen Dimension, the Pilgrim of the Great Cosmos, and the Goddess of Fortune. Sanyun was completely delighted. It happened very quickly. Besides, there were 3 of them. The Goddess of Fortune approached the young man and looked at him with a serious gaze. Sanyun decided that it was because of his excessive self-confidence and audacity. The young man did not know how to behave because nothing like this had ever happened to him in his past life. But then the Goddess of Luck folded her arms and smiled sweetly at the player. She showed that she was very interested in cooperation. The Goddess of Fortune was intrigued because she had never seen lucky fencers before. The young man felt a huge sense of relief. He realized that all 3 constellations wanted to sign a contract with him. Why shouldn't the guy take advantage of this and make sure? The Cleaner of the Fallen Dimension blessed the player for his hidden cruelty. He often met players who killed a lot, and he was interested in the young man because he had destroyed a huge number of orcs in a short period of time. The Pilgrim of the Great Cosmos was interested in the young man's true intentions. It was unclear why he had appeared. Perhaps he appeared before players who had a chance to become saints. Sanyong looked at all 3 constellations and thought about what the right thing to do would be. The young man guessed that the Pilgrim of the Great Cosmos had appeared here because he had seen the Goddess of Fortune. This goddess was popular even among other constellations. The Goddess of Fortune told the young man that she had no exclusive desires, meaning that the player could choose another constellation but would always be able to contact her later. This was excellent news and opened up new opportunities. It seemed like an incredible achievement for the entire gaming community. An archer capable of hitting his target even when shooting into empty space, thanks to the blessings of this world, did not have to worry about running out of arrows. This archer of the heavens was honored with the highest praise among archers, given his destructive power and high luck rating. In fact, it was all thanks to his contract with his 2 constellations. One of those who made the impossible possible was the Goddess of Luck. Sanghyun was still very confused as 3 constellations appeared before him at the same time. The young man needed time to think everything through. However, the constellations insisted that the young man ignore his worries and decide his own fate. One of the constellations said that it might have made the wrong decision. Sanghyun understood that the Goddess of Fortune was the most wonderful constellation, and there was no doubt about that. But if we consider the possibility that the other constellations would not choose him, then the player's fate would be decided right now. In his past life, more than 10 years had passed since the boy became a player, and he still had no constellations. And then one day, only 1 constellation connected with him. It was the late blossoming of a model student. Its appearance was like a saving grace. Sanghyun was ecstatic. Although his life was miserable, the young man hoped that a bright future awaited him. However, years passed and nothing changed. The player remained without consequences despite the presence of the constellation. Therefore, even now, the young man did not have high hopes that all his problems would be solved with the help of the constellation. There were always many absurd requirements to specifically change something in his status. In his past life, the guy was unable to use the power of the constellation. Although, if you think about it, it was thanks to it that the young man got the opportunity to return to the past. Therefore, he should remain grateful. But this past experience showed that the guy had to be attentive and careful because most likely he would not get a third chance to live his life. The young man shifted his gaze from one constellation to another. He could go with the holy powers and work on obtaining the status of a saint, or he could go down the path of destruction and become one of the main killers in the history of players, or he could choose luck and use it to achieve heights in various fields. In the end, the guy made his choice and accepted the invitation of one of the constellations. This constellation was the Goddess of Luck, with whom he immediately signed a contract. In the event of the player's death, this contract would be valid for 30 years. The notification stated that a being from another dimension was closely watching the player and the Goddess of Luck. When they signed the contract, many friendly constellations congratulated them and wished them all the best. Several hostile constellations that had planned to sign a contract with Sanayan declared that they would do everything in their power to stop his progress. The young man did not understand why his personality had attracted such interest, and why so many people were interested in his fate. One day, the young man decided that it was not worth paying attention to this now, and wished everyone good luck. The Goddess of Luck reached out her hand to the young man and expressed her admiration for his wise decision. Sanayan looked at his data, and what he read there caught his full attention. He couldn't even continue his conversation with the Goddess of Luck. The notification said that he would now truly be lucky in life. Many bonuses, unique artifacts, and the chance to earn the best titles and bonuses were now available to him. Sanyun couldn't calm down, enjoying reading that he now had many opportunities at his disposal, up to leveling up and increasing his stats several times over. Thanks to at least one point, the Goddess of Fortune was already clearly bored. The Goddess of Fortune asked the player what he would do with offers from other constellations. Sanyun replied that he was focused on his goddess, and the other constellations could go back to their business. It sounded strange, but the Pilgrim of the Great Cosmos said he would wait for them at the next meeting, and the Cleaner of the Fallen Dimension promised to do his best to knock the player's head off his shoulders. The Goddess of Luck praised the player for standing firm in his decision, but the young man understood that with the effects he had received, he no longer needed to worry about the upcoming battles. After that, Sanyun went in search of the final boss's room. He still hadn't cleared this solo dungeon. Upon encountering the final boss, the young man rushed into battle with newfound strength, especially since the Goddess of Fortune herself was present. Sanyun struck the final boss, wondering if he was really that weak because it was quite easy to do so. The young man attacked the huge orc with his sword. The monster managed to defend itself and gave him no chance to defeat it. The final boss of the dungeon was the greedy Goblin Lord. He was quite strong. The young man struck with his sword, but he was unable to pierce the goblin's armor and thick skin. The Goblin Lord suddenly used his hidden skill and activated the status ailment, Depression. Sanyun couldn't move. He stood as if spellbound, but at the same time knew that this skill would be used against him. Of course, it was an unpleasant moment, but it was not as strong and noticeable as stunning. The Depression effect forcibly lowered the target's motivation to fight. The young man used his recovery skill. At that moment, the orc was already about to pierce the guy with his axe. The decrease in motivation was not enough to completely stop the target's movement, although it had clear limitations. Sanyun believed that this skill would be useful when fighting weak monsters. The young man activated the recovery skill and decided it was time to try his luck. Thanks to the recovery skill, the depression effect was canceled, and the final boss was very angry when he realized this. The young man was able to inflict damage on his opponent, and the ability to cause depression was immediately destroyed. Sanyun was very confident. He turned to the final boss and said that he had hoped in vain for the depression effect. The young man then used Demon Strike, and the Goblin Lord was stunned. Sang-hyun immediately noticed that the stun time was half as long as usual, so he immediately rushed in to deliver slashing blows with his sword. Then he added a delay effect, which prolonged the stun for a few more seconds. While the goblin was immobilized, Sang-hyun was able to get close to the monster and find its weak spots. The young man practiced his skills on this final boss. He used the delay effect again, and the stun effect was extended once more. The young man jumped around the goblin, delivering slashing blows and prolonging the monster's life as much as possible, as well as his delay and stun abilities. Finally, the young man killed the final boss, and he was credited with clearing the Dark Goblin Swamp dungeon. Sang-hyun received a level up and a new title. The young man was very tired and glad that the battle was over. Sanyun tried to catch his breath. Today had been a tough day. From a life-and-death fight with gangsters to clearing out the dungeon, it was unclear why he had to work so hard. The Goddess of Luck approached her favorite and said that he was unlucky, and that this was clearly more than just a streak of bad luck. But now luck would often accompany the guy. In addition, the girl claimed that luck was a skill and suggested that the player's achievements today were all thanks to her. Sanyun did what he loved most. He began to allocate bonus points to the luck stat, and now the indicator exceeded 100. The dodge stat affected reaction speed, but then the guy's gaze fell on the shield lying next to the slain final boss. The luck stat affected the chance of artifacts dropping. This time, a magnificent artifact awaited the young man, the Shield of Goodness. Sanyun knew that thanks to the Goddess of Luck, he was always guaranteed an artifact. Kunda's shield increased strength with mana and converted damage taken into healing. With the help of the Goddess of Luck, such artifacts would now be encountered constantly. The player started the process of synchronizing mana with the Shield of Goodness. The Goddess of Luck was happy that she could help her player so successfully. Sanyun was already pleased with this turn of events. He knew for sure that all this was much more useful than the effects of the late blossoming of a model student. Not far from the residential area was a quest zone where you could spend time and rent a dungeon for future exploration. The manager gave a strict and unequivocal answer. No. Sanyun said he understood what the manager was trying to tell him. However, he had his own reasons. The manager demanded that the player think everything over again. However, the young man had already lost count of the number of corpses he had seen this week. He couldn't let things go wrong. Before that, the guy had to spend several hours in a car on the highway. The young man was in a great hurry because he had received classic rice and kimchi for the Goblin Shield. But fortunately, everything turned out fine. Then another car, as they say, gave up the ghost, and at some point simply decided not to go anywhere anymore. Almost all the sensors in the car showed that there was a problem with them and required an immediate solution. Sang-hyun realized that he needed to change cars, but getting to the city was more important than going to a car dealership. Sanyun knew that the lower a player's level, the more crimes bad people could commit against them. The young man did not want to live in constant fear, so moving to a more secure place like the player's town was the right decision. It should also be noted that artifacts can not only be earned, but also purchased, maintained, and improved. All of this required money, and now the young man understood that he needed funds. He needed a lot of money. Sang-hyun knew of a place where he could get enough of it. Along with the era of players, a system of quests appeared that had to be completed, and there was also an organization that calculated all these quests. This organization was called the Players Association. If the system was controlled by this organization, the young man could handle it and was confident that he would succeed. Finally, the guy got to the quest area in the car, despite all the flashing lights took him there. However, the manager immediately turned the guy around at the entrance. She said that players should visit dungeons that correspond to their level and should not enter areas that are too difficult. Sang-hyun swore that he would not cause any problems for the association and asked her to take his word for it. Of course, he was only at level 17, but it would be a shame to waste his impressive skills on a low-level dungeon. But the manager was adamant. She said she had heard such talk many times before, but then those players died. Players must visit areas that correspond to their level. Sang-hyun understood why this was the case. Many players overestimated their abilities, but now he had to go for broke. The young man did not want to go to low-level dungeons. The heated conversation attracted the attention of other players. Kim Miso was from the Eden Guild and was level 100. She approached the manager and asked what was going on. Sang-hyun recognized the girl. She was a pious archer named Kim Miso, the first level 100 player to achieve an A+ rank and the title of pious archer. In addition to her skills, the girl also stood out because she was the daughter of the chairman of Sacred Biotech. This meant that she was also known by the pseudonym Shadow Assassin. After the Shadow Assassin, who was the best assassin in the country, the best fencer in Korea was Cho Jin-ho. She was the daughter of the company that owned the largest share in the Eden Guild. In short, she was the most powerful player in history. The girl looked at Sang-hyun and asked if they had met before. Kim Miso admitted that she had been watching the guy for some time and now wanted to know why he needed high-level quests. The young man immediately admitted that it was for money. Many of the cool players who were there at the time thought that Kim Miso herself was talking to some stranger, but he was actually a complete nobody. Everyone hoped that the girl would now harshly reject this weakling, who was unknown to anyone. Kim Miso continued talking to the young man. She said that the quest was very difficult, but the young man insisted he wanted to complete this difficult level. Sang-hyun knew that the higher the risk, the higher the reward. The young man was not doing this for personal reasons. In her past life, Kim Miso had refused his request to join her guild, saying that he was not strong enough for them. Now, Sang-hyun did not hold a grudge against her, even though he remembered it. Kim Miso said that completing quests alone was prohibited by the Players Association. That was really awful. The young man had completely forgotten that these rules would only change in a few years. There was no point in begging anyone anymore, so Sang-hyun turned around and walked away, saying he had business to attend to. But then Kim Miso called out to him, saying she had an interesting idea. The girl suggested that the guy go on this quest with her. The players who witnessed this conversation were terribly jealous. They also wanted to participate with such a gorgeous girl. Sang-hyun was very cautious. He immediately suspected that Kim Miso had something in mind and asked what conditions she was proposing. The girl asked why the guy didn't think it was just a simple favor or a gesture of goodwill. However, the young man replied that life had taught him not to trust people. Kim Miso said that bitter experience can indeed teach a lot, but she had absolutely no conditions. On the contrary, she wanted to clear the area together with the guy. After all, if his skills and abilities turned out to be worse than he presented them, the young man would pay for it with his life. But if the young man's confidence was directly proportional to his abilities, the girl promised to offer her sincere apologies. It was a real challenge, and of course, Sang-hyun couldn't help but respond. He agreed to the condition. Kim Miso's influence went beyond that of a famous player. The value of the clothing brands she wore usually skyrocketed, and dozens of articles were published based on her words alone. If the girl called someone a cocky player, their career would immediately end. Sang-hyun confirmed that he was ready to go with her and thought it would be really fun. The driver took the players to the dungeon and was going to stay and wait for her. However, the girl ordered him to go about his business because they would not be free for a while. All the guild members had pretty busy schedules. Kim Miso understood that it would be difficult to find someone to go through the dungeon so suddenly without prior agreement. Once inside the administration building, the girl, who had her own reasons for going to the dungeon, overheard Sang-hyun's conversation. There were minimum requirements for participants to complete the tasks, but even fulfilling them was a burden for Kim Miso. And then she met the perfect companion, a very confident player. However, no one knew who he really was. So it remained a mystery to the girl and added an element of surprise to their shared mission. Kim Miso asked the manager what quest Sang-hyun wanted to complete. The manager checked the information on the form and provided the girl with the details. The choice of quest was very surprising. It was not gathering or hunting, but a defense quest. It required defeating every monster in order to pass. There was an empirical rule. In a group of 4 people, there should always be at least one member who could deal long-range damage. This was exactly the kind of quest this weirdo was going to go on. If it weren't for Kim Miso, he would have definitely died there. Sang-hyun asked the girl if she was afraid. The guy noticed that the beauty had suddenly fallen silent. He decided that she was scared. Sang Hyun suggested that if it was too difficult for her, they could wait for other players, someone who could deal long-range damage, or someone with a tank. Kim Miso replied that she wasn't afraid at all. The girl barely managed to refrain from saying that he was an overconfident fool. She gave one of her sweetest smiles and pressed the confirm button. The quest was accepted, and the players were transported to the quest area. They immediately found themselves near the gate. The female manager was still very nervous. Although Kim Miso was accompanying this newbie, the manager was worried that something bad might happen. The other players were amazed. They didn't know if the newbie really expected to complete this quest. It was almost impossible because the guy was only level 17, and the monsters there were for level hundreds. Moreover, it was unclear why Kim Miso herself had decided to help the newbie. She had a very cool reputation as the youngest A+ ranked player. The new ranking system was introduced by the Players Association because judging a player's strength solely by their level was not entirely accurate. Now, two characteristics were taken into account. The first was the number of dungeons cleared. The second was the player's overall combat instinct rating. Based on these indicators, Kim Miso was an A+ ranked player solely because of her combat instincts. The A+ rating only meant that there were players better than Kim Miso. However, now it didn't matter at all because the newbie went on a raid with the coolest girl. And now the gates to another dimension had disappeared, and with them, the players. The defense quest was called Night and Time of the Wolves. It took place in the city at night, and everything around was shrouded in darkness. Kim Miso stood on the roof of a building, looking into the distance, her bow and arrows at the ready. At that moment, Sang Hyun was walking alone through the empty night streets of the city. Kim Miso watched very closely. If things started to go south, she was going to help the guy, of course, but she hoped that this quest would bring him down to earth. Half an hour earlier, there had been an unpleasant conversation between the players. Sang Hyun told his partner not to interfere until he called her. In return, he promised to give her 5% of the proceeds. The girl was shocked. She hadn't misheard. She wouldn't have to participate at all. But getting 5% just for being there wasn't bad at all. Kim Miso was sure that the young man would not be able to cope on his own because there would be at least several hundred wolves. Besides, she was not interested in the money at all. The girl said that even she, despite being at level 100, would have to work hard to complete this quest alone. Sang Hyun was very confident and said that she just needed to watch. The girl stopped arguing and shouted after the departing guy that with every monster he missed, his share would decrease by 1%. And if he missed 95 monsters, he would be left with nothing. A huge, powerful paw soon appeared nearby. Soon a menacing growl was heard, and several wolves came out onto the road, blocking the way. Sang Hyun shouted that he would agree to any terms, but he was sure that this would not happen. The huge monster wolf bared its monstrous jaws, hoping for a delicious meal. The player was sure he would get everything he hoped for because he would not let a single monster escape. Soon the opponents rushed at each other. Kim Miso watched what was happening with bated breath. She was very worried. The first attack ended in complete destruction of the wolf pack. Their remains lay scattered across the road. Sang Hyun jumped over the bodies of the dead wolves and said that they were even queued up close, but his partner would never know that. Kim Miso, standing on the roof of the house, realized that the young man was not just confident for no reason. His strike was flawless. The stance he used embodied all the advantages of a two-handed sword. It was the perfect posture, exactly as fencers always talk about. Attack and defense as one. In addition, the young man minimized unnecessary movements, killing several enemies with a single blow. The girl understood that her new acquaintance's confidence was entirely justified. However, even for such confidence, there were too many monsters, and a pack of bloodthirsty wolves had already gathered around Sang Hyun. The young man knew that he was only at level 17 and wanted to prove that he could handle these monsters. Kim Miso was about to shoot and join the battle when she suddenly realized that something strange was happening. Sang Hyun used the Demon Strike skill at that very moment. The pack of wolves stopped for a few seconds and froze, as if rooted to the spot. It was incredible, but the young man had used the stun effect. Kim Miso was so impressed that she almost fell off the roof, but it was dangerous and no longer important. The guy had used a great skill. The girl counted the duration of the effect and realized that the stun lasted more than 4 seconds, even longer than Jinho's. This meant that the guy could calmly apply status effects and destroy monsters. That's exactly what Sang Hyun was doing. He cut down all the wolves while they were slowed down. It turned out to be quite easy. Sang Hyun looked ahead and finally saw someone he could fight. A huge black wolf, many times larger than ordinary wolves, was approaching the player at full speed. In his past life, the young man had not often encountered black wolves, but this was not their first meeting. The black wolf had the same stunning effect as the player, and the young man froze for a moment. Kim Miso, standing on the roof of the house, realized that she needed to help her friend urgently. The girl used an artifact and deactivated the stun that Sang Hyun had received from the black wolf. Carried away by watching Sang Hyun, Kim Miso completely forgot that the wolf also had a stun effect. Now the girl had to urgently remove the stun effect from the guy, and only then lecture him about safety. Of course, Sang Hyun had the ability to cause stun, but deactivating it at such a low level was practically impossible. At that very moment, thanks to the recovery effect, Sang Hyun shook off the stun and rushed to attack the black wolf. Kim Miso didn't understand how this was even possible, An almost perfect stance for a two-handed sword, an unusually long stun effect, and now the deactivation of a status effect at a low level. The Black Wolf was also surprised and quickly slowed down, realizing that his effect was not working. The monster thought that the victim would be unable to move due to the stun, but the player was moving freely again and jumping high above the beast. This moment could not be missed. Sang-hyun took advantage of it and plunged his long sword into the monster's body. It is situations like these that determine the outcome of the entire battle. And now stunned without the stun effect, the Black Wolf was confused, and the player took advantage of the opportune moment. The huge carcass of the monster fell on Sang-hyun and stained his clothes, although he had hoped to slip through. Sang-hyun realized that he was already covered in mud, so he decided to have some fun and arrange a real massacre. Kim Miso was still on the roof of a high-rise building, watching her partner. But the girl had almost relaxed, her gaze no longer frightened. She just wanted to understand who he was. The young man killed a few more wolves and now stood calmly among the slain monsters. A notification about a level up came. It was nice. In addition, several new titles were received. Sang-hyun also received interested glances from the girl and noticed that her doubts had disappeared and her eyes had completely switched to observation mode. The young man understood that he had an audience, so he couldn't just sit around doing nothing. It was probably time to wrap things up. Just then, a new enemy appeared, and Sang-hyun was ready to face him. The final boss was the Lord of the Full Moon Wolves, huge and bloodthirsty. The predator immediately rushed to attack, but the young man already knew that the wolves' attacks were quite predictable. In 30 minutes, the boy had studied all the wolves' patterns and was now ready to fend them off quickly and without hesitation. The young man struck the wolf and jumped over it, knowing the enemy's behavior pattern. However, due to the resistance of the Wolf Lord's skills, the demon strike did not work. As expected, the final boss was able to block some of Sang-hyun's skills. Kim Miso watched the two, thinking it was complete madness. There was nothing simple about it. The guy wasn't just immobilized, he was also resisting. In addition, the player swung a huge sword as if it were a piece of paper, striking blows and trying to break through the final boss's defense. At one point, the wolf decided to strike with its paw, but the young man covered himself with his sword as if it were a shield. The wolf was sure that his attack would not be repelled and continued to attack the young man. But Sang-hyun could anticipate the unpredictable movements of the Wolf Lord. The young man had suffered a lot in his past life and now knew everything his opponent could offer. Kim Miso, continuing to watch the fight closely, realized that this was not just a life-and-death struggle. The girl guessed that the young man was simply showing her his strength. He was literally showing off in front of the beauty. Kim Miso had never met such players before. He was not like an ordinary person. Sang-hyun decided it was time to end the fight because it had already lasted longer than he had expected. The guy had managed to show off in front of the beauty, and if something went wrong, he might not have enough strength. Sang-hyun ran away, and the enraged leader of the wolves rushed after him. The young man ran very fast and didn't understand why he still had so much strength. If this continued, the player would use up his strength faster than his opponent would die, and his stamina was already running out. But then the wolf decided to do what it usually does, deliver a powerful blow with a large window for counterattack. In fact, it was a trick to deliver one deadly blow. It was a special pattern of the Wolf Lord that had taken the lives of countless players. Sang-hyun stopped abruptly, assumed a defensive stance, and remembered that he had never used this in actual combat, but sometimes one has to act rashly. As expected, the wolf lunged one paw at the player, gradually pulling back the other, with which it was going to deliver a fatal blow. Kim Miso froze in horror as she watched the fight. It looked as if the player had been attacked by the monster's paws. Everything around was covered in blood. Kim Miso realized how foolish she had been and that she couldn't even be called a player. Even if the young man had shown incredible skills, Miso shouldn't have just stood by. It was like killing Sang-hyun. The girl burst into tears, sobbing and begging for forgiveness for not helping the player. Suddenly, she noticed a strange light coming from the battlefield. Kundas's shield was completely absorbed, crumbled to dust, and disappeared forever. The special effects sacrifice was obtained as a result of the wipe. The conditional activation recovery ability proved to be very useful during absorption. The player had to choose a part of the body to apply the recovery effect to. Sang-hyun noticed that the body was divided too specifically into 16 parts, which was excessive. Usually the safest choice is the back, but here even the back was divided into zones, which was ineffective. In this case, the player had to use the skill more carefully, and the young man finally activated Sacrifice. The health recovery effect worked immediately. If the young man had miscalculated even slightly, he would have died instantly. But in the end, he killed two birds with one stone. Sang-hyun activated non-demon strike against his opponent. The huge wolf froze, and the player decided that either he was very lucky or the wolf was simply unlucky. Sang-hyun had cut off the monster's right arm during the previous attack, and now he used it to immobilize it. Still, it wasn't worth delaying, and the young man decided it was time to move on to the next test. Kim Miso had already climbed down from the roof and was standing nearby, in a pool of wolf blood, watching the final blows. In the end, the immobilization didn't work the first time, but Sang-hyun managed to accomplish the task. The player stood next to the body of the monster, which was no longer resisting, bleeding out, and didn't know whether to be happy. At that moment, he heard Kim Miso approach him from behind. The girl looked at the guy without saying a word. She was pleasantly surprised and amazed by his abilities. The beauty didn't want to admit that she almost cried, thinking that the guy had died, and only said that she almost had a heart attack. The guy should have said that he had healing skills, but the beauty wanted to know how he knew the patterns of the Lord of Wolves. Perhaps he was living a second life. Kim Miso had seen many swordsmen before, but none of them were as mysterious as Shin Sang-hyun. The girl couldn't find the words to describe what was happening. Sang-hyun didn't want to tell the truth and tried to make a joke out of it. Kim Miso looked at the guy expectantly, hoping he would tell his story. Sang-hyun said he felt some kind of incomprehensible pressure from her. The girl stopped pressing him and said that he just looked like a ranked player and that it would be better to change the subject. It was indeed time to finish off this monster, and Sang-hyun took up his sword again. He said he would do it gently and end the suffering of the monstrous monster. It really was necessary to end it, because the wolf also seemed ready to die. Sang-hyun ended up receiving his first title with the rank called Deadly Duel. He felt a slight nostalgia for his past life. The girl asked if he had received his title, because after clearing this area, a new one is usually issued. Kim Miso said that she had also gone through this dungeon alone, although it looked like she was cheating. Finally, the girl admitted that she had absolutely nothing to be proud of because she had cleared everything only thanks to artifacts. Sang-hyun tried to support the beauty and said that using artifacts was also a very important skill. Kim Miso said that she had a lot of artifacts and they all cost more than 200 million won. However, comparing this to how a player uses a mass-produced two-handed sword that is sold everywhere for pennies, she felt ashamed. Just then, the title Deadly Duel was activated. With its help, the young man could sense allies and opponents within a radius of several meters. After that, the guy became completely embarrassed, deactivated the title, and felt a little out of place. Kim Miso said that she was about to leave the dungeon, but she still needed to contact the porters. Sang-hyun knew that the rewards for completing tasks included monster byproducts, so he needed to call the porters. The guy hoped to look reliable enough after dealing with the annoying tasks, but suddenly remembered the promised reward, which he hadn't given to the girl. Kim Miso said that everything was fine, and he shouldn't worry so much. The beauty said that now they would be seeing each other quite often, and the young man should treat this amount as her investment in him. Sang-hyun agreed to accept these conditions, but still felt that he couldn't relax completely while he was with the girl. Kim Miso had already left first, and the guy was just about to leave the dungeon when suddenly a light appeared behind him. The young man decided to immediately check the reward he had been waiting for so long and discovered a blue moonstone. Sang-hyun was literally trembling with impatience and excitement. This precious stone was imbued with the faith of the Silver Wolf tribe. It was a platinum-ranked item, and the young man could not hold back his tears of joy and admiration. The platinum artifact was worth at least 1 billion, which was equivalent to an apartment in the city center. The goddess of luck asked if the young man believed that this was the thrill of her touch. The owner of the torn lips strongly objected to the biased luck that the player was receiving and suggested removing the goddess of luck from the player system. However, the goddess of luck unexpectedly proposed to vote for the constellation connected to the player system. The proposal was accepted unanimously, and the owner of the torn lips could no longer act as a constellation. Sang-hyun sat there dumbfounded, unable to comprehend how such actions could be permitted, but he knew that his goddess of fortune was quite popular. The player wanted to absorb about half of the platinum artifact for the first time. There was also an additional special effect that increased health regeneration and recovery speed. Simply put, the player became almost a monster when the moon rose. Sang-hyun synchronized the blue moonstone with his mother and was ready to leave the quest area. The young man entered the players' association lobby a completely different person, as if he had become taller and stronger. Many players of different ages and types were waiting for him in the lobby. The anxious manager looked at the guy, still worried about his life, and now knew that Shin Sang-hyun had completed the quest on his own. Kim Miso wouldn't lie to everyone, so she could be taken at her word. It was hard to imagine that anyone in their right mind would go on a quest for level 100 when they were only level 17. Any player would try to stop such a suicidal person. The manager did her best to prevent this, and now she had to remember Shin Sang-hyun's appearance, because he would be appearing here often. Sang-hyun even felt sorry for the manager. She was genuinely worried about him. But then various players rushed up to the guy, offering him to join their associations on better terms. Kim Miso stepped forward, apologized to the guys, and said she needed to discuss something with Mr. Shin. The girl looked at the player, hinting that she had a tempting offer. Sang-hyun was glad that Kim Miso had saved him from the other players, but he was curious about her plan. Sang-hyun and Miso jumped into the girl's car and drove away from the players' association. While they were driving, a huge amount of money was credited to the guy's account. This was a welcome surprise, especially since the reward for completing the quest was credited so quickly and in such a large amount. The guy admitted that he had never received so much money so quickly before, and Kim Miso said that she had called the porters and sped up the process. Sang-hyun was literally stunned by the amount of money and thanked the girl for taking care of him. Kim Miso turned to the driver, and he confirmed that he understood his mistress. A secret mode was activated inside the car, and the young people found themselves in an almost impenetrable bunker. Sang-hyun immediately thought that this was to be expected. Nothing good comes for free, and now something serious must happen. Kim Miso said that she was not inclined to sugarcoat things, so she got straight to the point and offered the player Shin Sang-hyun to join the Eden Guild. Sang-hyun noted that despite his lack of skills, the girl decided to show confidence and invited him to the guild. The Eden Guild was a real paradise for players and was the dream of almost everyone. In his previous life, the young man was a member of a very ordinary guild, and this gave him a sense of security. His guild was a small gathering of untalented players who had nowhere else to go. However, the guy felt comfortable there until one incident when all his comrades died. But now, as the young man was growing up very quickly, he didn't need any infrastructure because this guild could only become a burden for him. At this stage, playing alone would contribute to his rapid growth, so Sang-hyun decided to turn down this generous offer. Kim Miso asked if the guy wanted to start his own solo guild. The girl admitted that it was not difficult to guess, given the young man's abilities. In addition, she was the daughter of the chairman of a large corporation, so she immediately thought on a large scale. Kim Miso was the only player who knew about this rapid growth. Sang-hyun noted that even though the girl knew he preferred to play alone, she still laid all her cards on the table and showed interest in him. The beauty was creating relationships that could benefit her in the future. She was an excellent negotiator. There was a separate town for players near Jamsil Station. The sales manager confirmed that according to the contract, the deposit was 100 million and the monthly payment was 5 million. Sang-hyun noted that the girl mentioned such frightening figures with a very sweet smile, and therefore they did not even seem scary. However, the guy was not easily frightened and signed the contract because it really was a great deal, and many players dreamed of living there. Sang-hyun quickly found himself a new place to live, probably thanks to the goddess of luck. The guy opened the window, stood there, looked at the street, and thought about the global changes that had taken place in his life in such a short period of time. His mysterious return to the past and then the sudden changes were overwhelming even for the young man himself. For days, the guy was focused only on figuring everything out and had no idea how to move forward. But soon his worldview changed completely, and finally the young man could feel the blood rushing through his veins and life returning to his body. Moreover, it was not just any body, but a young and youthful one. And now the youth he felt wouldn't let him sit still, so Sang-hyun firmly decided to live this life differently. The guy swore not to be a coward in life again. Moreover, opportunities for his growth continued to arrive. It seemed that he didn't even have to make any effort. But then the well-known reporter Park Jong-min called to gather information about the new star among the players. This was the same reporter who interviewed the most famous players. He had already heard about the quest with Miss Kim Miso. The reporter wanted to gather exclusive information and was now talking to Miss Miso about the recent quest. Sang-hyun thanked the girl for giving him a ride, but the beauty still had a little business to attend to. She said that she and her friends were going to explore the unknown gates in the near future. She was forming a free team of only 4 people with a level of at least 120. Sang-hyun didn't even wait to hear her out. He immediately shouted that he was in and that she could count on him. Kim Miso was surprised because just recently the young man had rejected her guild offer. But this time he agreed immediately. This guy was becoming more and more interesting. The guy was happy to have the chance to enter the gate. Simply put, a dungeon is a fixed location. Once you enter, the entrance and exit are fixed, and traps and monsters act according to a predetermined program. But the gate is a constantly changing location. When you clear it, the exits and entrances change in real time, and sometimes even the monsters change. As always, the greater the danger, the better the reward. This is an unspoken rule of the gaming world. And if it's an unknown gate, a high-ranking artifact is guaranteed to drop. Kim Miso must have already received such an artifact, because it was thanks to it that she was able to remove the Black Wolf's restriction. The girl said she would definitely contact the young man as soon as she found out more details, and most likely they would be in regular contact in the near future. Kim handed the young man her phone so he could save his number. But just as the young man took the phone, a message popped up on it, a reminder that he needed to meet with Gregory. Kim immediately snatched the phone back, apologized, and said she just wanted him to write down his number. Kim herself did not understand what was happening to her and why she wanted to hide the fact that she was meeting Gregory from Sang-hyun. Sang-hyun knew that this guy had his own story. However, every player had a story and a lot of baggage behind them. Even Shin Sang-hyun himself had a story that he didn't want to tell anyone. If people found out that he had returned to the past, it could affect their attitude towards him. Sang-hyun was curious to know where this guy was now and what he was doing. After all, they had spent several years together, and he could at least show his face. In the VIP room of the Eden Guild, Kim met with the player over a cup of coffee. The man said he was going to spend time with her for the first time in a long time, while the girl was constantly waiting for a message from someone, staring at her phone. Kim said she was waiting for a reply from Shin Sang-hyun because they were going to explore new gates together. The guy immediately said that the girl was head over heels in love with this newcomer, but this player could maintain stability longer than anyone else and just as coolly rejected the offer to join the guild. The girl said there was no need to worry about it. Kim noted that the guy's sword skills were as good as, if not better than, the man's. Cho Jin-ho pointed out that comparing him to a newbie was a bit much. The next meeting took place on the training grounds. Sang-hyun called the girl and said that he had received her message about the gate and was ready to discuss it. Kim Miso noted that he had reacted too quickly and began to explain that these unknown gates had just appeared near the station. Preliminary reconnaissance of the middle zone had already been carried out. The girl sent internal information, and now Sang-hyun could read it. Sure enough, the young man received a message about these gates. It told him about the middle boss, Cerberus. Sang-hyun was very pleased. He had just acquired a skill and could now test it very quickly. Getting to Cerberus meant earning excellent effects and artifacts. Sang-hyun confirmed to the girl on the phone that he had studied the information, thanked her for the warning, and they agreed to contact each other when the time was known. Captain Yoon was near Sang-hyun at that moment. He was happy to meet this strange and amazing young man. Sang-hyun had suddenly become a celebrity, so there was no need to be offended that he was constantly receiving calls. Sang-hyun was embarrassed. He said that he was not a celebrity at all and that he still had a lot to do. Captain Yoon said that apparently the young man had not yet received that call and showed him the phone saying, "It's better to see once than hear 100 times." An article was published in a well-known magazine, and the front page was about the legendary newcomer. Of course, anyone would become famous after that. Sang-hyun was very surprised and didn't even know if he was happy or not. He never expected his photo to be published in such an important magazine. Actually, it was strange that the journalist published an article about him without prior approval. Captain Yoon didn't know what to feel. Of course, his fourth cousins might start calling, but that was all minor stuff. Sang-hyun decided to get down to business because he had something else to worry about. The captain handed him a paper bag with something glowing inside and said they had already discussed it. Sang-hyun looked into the bag, thanked the captain, and said that he really wanted to discuss the issue of artifacts. From the outside, it might have seemed that the captain had given them to him for free. It was unclear why the young man didn't just buy himself new artifacts. Sang-hyun knew that these items still bore the fingerprints of his past life, but he replied aloud that he simply wanted to inherit Captain Yoon's fighting spirit. Yoon didn't believe these excuses, but Sang-hyun didn't want to explain that the old artifacts. He just said that he had his own superstitions. At that moment, a girl approached them and apologized for being late. She explained that she had trouble finding parking and suggested they start appraising the artifacts right away. It turned out that Captain Yoon had invited an appraiser to help close the deal. The captain did this so that the guy wouldn't underestimate him just because they were friends. Everything had to be calculated honestly and fairly. After that, all the certificates were laid out and activated. The female appraiser got to work. She began scanning the items to determine their value. Soon her work was completed. The girl announced the price, which coincided with what had been planned, meaning the deal was conducted fairly. The captain said he had one more thing he wanted to discuss before finishing and began to pull the sword out of its sheath. The player offered to take a look at his sword. San-young immediately refused, saying that he did not have the proper qualifications to do so. But the captain said he didn't want to watch the pretense anymore. He wasn't stupid enough not to understand that the young man was much higher in rank than him, and he wasn't stubborn enough to let his ego get in the way of learning something. Sang-hyun tried very hard to avoid such situations. He simply hated them. But the captain would not agree to any concessions. He was a proud and intelligent player. Sang-hyun didn't want to ignore or offend someone who was sincere towards him. That would be heartless. The young man suggested that the captain ignore him and simply show what a player usually does with a sword. For safety reasons, Sang-hyun suggested that the female evaluator stand behind him. The captain got ready and told everyone to pay attention because he was about to begin, and soon he really did start swinging his sword. Of course, the captain wielded the sword well, but it was of little use. Sang-hyun just watched what was happening, thinking about how he could help and what advice he would need to give. Yoon Dae-hyun was in a frenzy. He swung his sword and delivered virtual blows to a multitude of opponents. At one point, Sang-hyun called out to him, although the captain thought he still had more to show the young man. Sang-hyun asked what was wrong with the captain's left arm, as it seemed to be fine. This question surprised the captain greatly. He explained that when a player swings with his right hand, his left shoulder opens too early. From the outside, it looked as if the player was paying too much attention to his left side. Well, of course, it could have been a mistake. Captain Yoon admitted that the young man was right. He had a minor injury that blocked his left side. Most of the injuries the guy had suffered as a child while exploring the dungeon were on his left side. Over the years, he had never been able to completely heal his shoulder. Sang-hyun said that it was easy to deal with and that everything was treatable. The injury was easier to heal than it seemed. The player needed to stop hiding the part he was aware of and instead choose a bold sword-wielding style that would reveal it. It is also necessary to slightly change the grip, which will alter the rhythm of movement. Of course, it is impossible to change it completely, but such small details will improve the player's technique. Sang-hyun continued to point out the captain's fingers, showing which ones to squeeze harder and which ones to relax. The female evaluator already saw that no one was paying attention to her, but the guys were getting closer and closer to each other. Sang-hyun offered supportive comments, showing where it was better to bend and how to shift weight from one foot to the other. Soon, the guys merged into one figure, as if they were dancing some kind of dance. Captain Yoon was thrilled with this lesson. He realized that he still had a lot to learn. At that moment, the appraiser had no idea what was going on around her and went to the browser to figure out how the guys held each other when teaching sword fighting. After buying some new artifacts, Sang-hyun went on with his business. The deal was quite good, even though it cost him 4 million won, but the benefits the guy would get from these artifacts were worth much more. Yoon Dae-hyun looked very satisfied after the sword training lesson, and the appraiser looked at them strangely, but most likely, the girl was just tired of waiting. Sang-hyun was eager to use these artifacts as soon as possible to see how much progress he would make, especially since he could be invited to the opening of the next gate at any moment. The young man had to slam on the brakes because there were some guys standing right in the parking spot. Sang-hyun apologized to the men, thinking that he had been distracted and hadn't noticed them. However, it turned out that the fat man had been waiting for him for a long time and was now glad that the guy had finally shown up. The man leaned toward the driver's window and told Sang-hyun to get out of his car as soon as possible. Sang-hyun didn't understand what was going on because it was his car. However, the guys insisted that he was wrong. Shin Sang-hyun looked really discouraged. He knew he hadn't sold his car to anyone yet. But then the fat man opened his jacket and showed that he had the ability to set everything on fire. And if the guy didn't want to burn to death inside his car, he'd better get out of it. Sang-hyun finally remembered these guys. They belonged to the Utopia Guild. These guys always chose weaker opponents and taught lessons to newbies. But in reality, they were just servants and were only capable of pretending and shooting content for YouTube. Thanks to their content, the guys had as many as 2 loyal subscribers who always watched their new videos. But one day the YouTuber crossed the line. As a result, he was arrested and imprisoned, received a life sentence, and was soon forgotten. Sang-hyun remembered all this information from his past life. The young man had not yet figured out how to behave in this situation. Both of these guys were completely stupid, and, of course, they had to be dealt with accordingly. Sang-hyun was in a hurry to get home to use his new artifacts and make progress. But these thugs found him, so he could test some of his abilities on them. Sang-hyun got out of the car, holding his sword in his hands. The fat guy started saying that he represented the players' security in this town, and many had already complained about the guy, so Sang-hyun had better calm down. The fat guy said that some newbie was driving around in a crappy car and embarrassing all the players in this town. The tough guys were very angry that they now shared a house with some punk who drove around in a crappy car. The fat guy kicked Sang-hyun's car. Sang-hyun had never encountered such insolence and audacity before. He literally froze in surprise. The fat guy said that if the guy didn't want his car to be turned into a pile of scrap metal, he'd better pack up his stuff and get out of town. The noise attracted the attention of other players, but they were afraid of these 2 thugs who were now terrorizing some unknown guy. Sang-hyun sat down next to the car, examining the damage. But at that moment, one of the neighbors recognized the young man who had been on a quest with Kim Miso earlier that day. Sang-hyun deliberately sat near the car for as long as possible, trying to calm down or, conversely, provoke his opponent into acting aggressively. The bandits also recognized the young man. He had recently been on the cover of a magazine, and it was he who had completed the quest with Kim Miso and cleared the level 100 dungeon single-handedly. This information did not seem plausible because the guy looked like a real weakling and an absolute loser. Besides, it was hard to believe that Kim Miso would let a newbie take all the glory after completing the quest. The guys had already figured out what to call their next video, in which they were going to deal with the star. The guys decided that the video would be called Teaching a Newbie a Lesson, and one of the jerks had already started filming. He said he was ready to go to training with the newbie, and if he won, the young man would have to leave the city of players forever. And if Shin Sang-hyun wins the training session, the guys promised to leave him alone. The fat guy continued to taunt the young man, saying that the newbie looked just like a real man. But suddenly, Sang-hyun turned his face, full of hatred and anger, and said to the fat guy, "If you add 500 million and your wrist to the pair, I'll agree to the deal. But if you're scared, you better get lost right now." The fat man couldn't believe his ears. Did this new kid dare to open his filthy mouth? At that moment, the fat man's friend called him over to distract him for a moment and approach him on urgent business. The bully wanted to show his friend the chat that was commenting on what was happening right now. The viewers were ready to watch the show and agreed to a bet of 500 million. Sang-hyun asked the fat man if he agreed to such a bet, or if he had shit his pants. The fat man understood that if he agreed, the video would be age restricted and he would not be able to earn any money. Sang-hyun decided not to miss the chance and relieve his stress by taking advantage of the situation. And so the guys faced each other right in the courtyard for players. Other residents of the buildings approached and, seeing that something was happening, realized that, as usual, 2 bullies were picking on a newcomer. But then the neighbors began to recognize the celebrity. It turned out that the guy lived in the same building as them, and some began to offer to spend time with him. Sang-hyun activated training mode. The fat guy said he had fulfilled all the conditions. Namely, he had put 500 million and his wrist on the line. The player claimed that there was no need to worry, he would keep his word. But everyone was sure that Sang-hyun would be forced to beg for mercy. Soon, the training mode was fully set up, and the players began combat training. Shin Sang-hyun was focused and concentrated. He waited for his opponents to start. Yeonchul activated his fire, saying that he was about to begin and had no intention of messing around with his opponent. But before the player could even blink, Sang-hyun's silhouette appeared above him with a sword in his hands. The young man announced that he wasn't joking either, and even if Yeonchul begged for mercy, the guy still wouldn't spare him. All the TVS in the country were broadcasting this duel live, which was taking place in the player's town. Kim Miso also turned on the TV and soon recognized one of the guys as her new friend, Sang Hyun. The girl didn't understand what was happening. Terrible words came from the TV. Don't expect mercy, even if you beg for it. Choi Yeon-chul was from the Utopia Guild and was one of the main thugs. He was always showing off because his uncle was some kind of boss. At that moment, a girl entered the locker room and noticed that her friend was very upset about something. Shinteri was also from the Eden Guild. She asked why her friend was so gloomy. Glancing at the TV screen, the girl immediately recognized the young man because he was now featured in all the magazines and news channels. He was the very young man that Kim Miso wanted to recruit to their guild. The girl didn't understand what the guy had forgotten on that crappy podcast. Shinteri immediately began to assess the young man's fighting abilities, saying that his movements were quite sharp. Yeon-chul clearly did not expect his opponent to be so fast and agile. Yeon-chul knew he had to take out this newbie in one move because the kid was definitely asking for it. The bandit threw a fireball at his opponent. Sang Hyun was ready to parry the blow. The young man raised his sword and used it to deflect the attack, redirecting the blast wave elsewhere. The spectators watched the guy in surprise, not understanding what was happening to him. At that moment, Sang Hyun felt that, for the first time since returning to the past, his body was no longer letting him down and had become completely obedient. Just a couple of hours ago, Sang Hyun thanked the appraiser for the quick deal and received new artifacts. The girl said that he shouldn't thank her because the guys had also worked hard together. Yoon Dae-hyun suggested celebrating the deal and invited the appraiser to join them, especially since he now had money. Sang Hyun immediately apologized and said that he couldn't join them, but that the two of them could have a great time together. The captain didn't understand why the guy was ignoring him, probably because the price of the artifacts was too high. Dae-hyun was even willing to return some of the money, but the young man said that he already had plans for tonight and sincerely apologized. Shun Sang-hyun didn't want to explain to his friend that right now, the artifacts would be much more appealing to him than any drink. The appraiser also remembered that she had plans for tonight and tried to get away from Captain Yoon as quickly as possible. Soon, the young man was finally left alone. He sat down on a bench in the gazebo and placed the bag with the precious artifacts next to him. The young man placed his hand on the artifacts and measured their absorption rate, calculating the basic absorption norm for these items. It turned out that he could absorb about 90% of the artifacts at once. It was very powerful, and the goddess of luck believed that all such joys came from her. Usually the guy only got a tenth of that amount due to absorption limitations. But as expected, the old artifacts were a different story. Sang Hyun remembered that he had long wanted to ask the goddess of luck, as she was known as the social constellation. Perhaps she had heard something about the late dawn constellation, the model student. The goddess of luck said that lately all her attention had been focused on the player, and now she was scolding him for his interest in another constellation. Sang Hyun admitted that this constellation meant a lot to him. On the other hand, it was perfectly understandable why the goddess of luck was offended and no longer wanted to continue the conversation. After that, the goddess of luck turned back to the guy and stopped being upset with him. The goddess of fortune also promised that she would be very generous and look for this constellation for the player. When all the conversations were over, Sang Hyun could finally get down to the most interesting part. At last, the guy could begin his feast, and soon the process of synchronizing mana with all the artifacts was launched. The top 5 dishes for a real man appeared before the guy. It didn't matter how worn out the artifacts were, even real dishes wouldn't be as brutal and delicious. Because it was these artifacts that provided the maximum degree of assimilation, one could imagine how strong the guy would become when he absorbed them. Sang Hyun activated the title True Duel, and now he understood that things were about to get heated. Yeon-chul felt like he was already out of breath, because in reality, he wasn't a player, but just an ordinary blogger. Gathering all his strength and realizing that his blogging career was going down the drain, Yeon-chul rushed to attack his opponent. Kim Miso was very worried as she watched the live broadcast. However, her friend was completely calm and confident in this guy. It was immediately clear that Sang Hyun would easily be able to dodge such an attack. Sang Hyun asked his opponent if he had forgotten their agreement. The young man was enjoying what was happening and was completely confident in himself. After that, Sang Hyun launched his attack, and now he was about to strike his opponent. Sang Hyun planned to take the player's arm along with 500 million won. His friend, who was filming everything on video, was happy because he was sure that the young man would fall into the trap. Sang Hyun suddenly felt ice rising up his leg, and the young man couldn't move any further. At that moment, the fat man Yeon-chul jumped up to him and said that he had won, and now the young man could do nothing to him. Sang Hyun looked down at his feet and realized that he had been hit with a freeze spell. Terry, who was watching the battle, realized that Yeon-chul could use more than just fire magic, which is why such an icy twist could work. But Kim Miso began to giggle strangely and then warned her friend not to be surprised and to listen to her carefully. The newcomer should not be underestimated. Sang Hyun could even cancel the effect of an entire stat. Now everyone would understand why Kim Miso wanted to recruit this guy into her guild so badly. But you had to see it with your own eyes, because usually such things are only talked about in gossip. The image that was broadcast was terrible. The young man was almost completely covered in ice, and it was clear that he would not be able to win. Yeon-chul was even a little confused. He didn't understand what was going on and where his opponent had gone. Instead of the player, there were now chunks of ice. But just then, some kind of Zen moment happened and the skill was activated. Until the player uses the stat effect cancellation, there will be no way out. Yeonchol stared blankly at his opponent in the middle of the ice, just as Sang-hyun jumped on him from above with a sword in his hands. Sang-hyun knocked the fat man down with his feet and thrust his sword where the blow was supposed to land. Fortunately or unfortunately, Yeonchul was not killed. He was saved by the training mod, and the fatal damage was prevented by the training defense. However, this did not change the fact that all the spectators and witnesses of the fight saw who the really cool player was. They also saw the real shame of the fat Yeonchul. If you look closely at Sang-hyun, you can see that he gives off a different vibe. The players couldn't understand what trick he used and what resources he used to win this training match. Shinteri also tried to understand what had happened. It was like the awakening of some new skill. The girl said it was something like psychedelia or transcendence. Seeing those black pupils, Shinteri was more inclined to believe that it was psychedelia after all. As far as the girl understood, inflicting damage with such skills took a tremendous amount of strength. It seemed that Sang-hyun was going to win without his opponent even touching him once. Kim Miso insisted that this would not work because the guy had never used such a skill with her. Shinteri continued to argue that great luck was needed to obtain this skill. In that case, there were two possibilities. Either there was no reason to use this skill when they were completing the quest together, or the guy had acquired this skill recently. But that was a very short period of time, and it was practically impossible to achieve. At that moment, the female appraiser was sitting in her office analyzing recent transactions. She was reading some information and was very alarmed. The girl broke out in a cold sweat and said that things were bad. Sang-hyun bought a bracelet today, but there was no complete information about it. This bracelet was left by the sages, and perhaps it contains beneficial power. But it is so weak that if a person is not particularly lucky, it is better not to expect anything. This bracelet had very little power, and it was possible that it could grow. The appraiser decided to check the hidden skill, although she was sure that it was also negligible. But if the hidden skill was activated, then it was clear that the goddess of luck had kissed this player. The hidden skill of the bracelet was psychedelic. The player fell into a state of enormous power, similar to a berserker. And now the young man asked his opponent what was going on with his wrist. Sang-hyun suggested turning off the training mode and trying the battle again. Yeonchul felt completely crushed and defeated. He didn't even want to talk to this nasty newbie. Yeonchul underestimated his opponent because he looked like a weakling. Therefore, the player did not expect such power, but now he had to take the duel very seriously. Yeonchul decided that he needed distance first and foremost, though he didn't know if it would make any difference. The only thing was that it was completely different from before. Yeonchul had heard that the newcomer was strong, but he never imagined he would be this powerful. At that moment, Sang-hyun began to attack his opponent, and it was so powerful that the spectators couldn't bear to watch and turned away. Even the fat guy's friend was no longer sure of his buddy's victory, although he continued to film, hoping to at least make some money from it. Sang-hyun jumped close to his opponent and pinned his head with his hand. The guy was very strong. He said it was time to end this training and time to keep his promises. Sang-hyun pressed his opponent's head to the ground and held it without straining. Sang-hyun announced that the training mode would, of course, leave Yeonchul alive. But before that happened, Sang-hyun thoroughly tormented his opponent. Yeonchul was already too scared. He started screaming and begging for mercy, saying that the rookie had defeated him. After that, Yeonchul promised to transfer the entire amount of money immediately, and only then did Sang-hyun let the guy go, saying that he agreed and considered the dispute over. Yeonchul said that what would happen between them now was personal. Sang-hyun wanted to clarify what he meant by personal, but it was clear that the guy was not feeling well at all. 3 days ago, the young man drove his car to a repair shop. The mechanic promised to fix the car, but warned that it would be better to replace it soon. The fact was that it was too old a model, and it was already difficult to find spare parts for it. Sang-hyun was very upset to hear this. The mechanic thought that the young man was very attached to his car, but still advised him to part with it. Sang-hyun felt that this car was practically like a relative to him. It had always been with him, and in its time, the car had also enjoyed driving with him. And it seemed that the car also responded to the young man, saying that it was happy to take him everywhere. The mechanic couldn't hold back his tears of emotion. And so the next blow was truly personal. Sang-hyun swung his fist and said that this blow was for his car, which the fat man had damaged. Sang-hyun was so furious that Yeonchul had no doubt about his opponent's particularly cruel intentions and began to beg for mercy, forgetting his reputation as a tough guy. Yeonchul shed tears so sincerely and begged for forgiveness that even the spectators who were present were moved and began to cry along with the player. In short, this training duel impressed everyone because both players appeared in completely new roles. The tough guy was crying bitter tears, and the quiet newcomer was furious. All of this was captured on video, and now Yeonchul's shame has become public knowledge. Even his friend, who filmed everything, didn't know which way to run or how to get out of this mess. The guy felt that they had gotten themselves into a lot of trouble that could have been avoided. At that moment, a man approached the guy and asked if he was really Jeon Seong-ho, who always filmed videos for his YouTube channel. It turned out to be an administrator from the Utopia Guild. He said that the players had crossed the line and would now be held accountable. Jung Seung-ho started to apologize, but the administrator was not really listening because his attention was drawn to the newcomer. The young man was standing next to Yeon-chul, who had wet himself out of fear. This newcomer had only recently awakened, but he had already dealt with a tough player. The administrator immediately wanted to know more about this guy and went over to meet him. The man introduced himself. He was the administrator, and he had come to resolve the incident and pay compensation. Sung-hyun carefully examined his ID. At first, this desire greatly confused the man. He decided that the player was very arrogant. However, he soon realized that it was not arrogance. Sung-hyun radiated the composure of a player who had been through a lot. His skills and behavior clearly exceeded the stated level. He bowed and introduced himself. My name is Moon Baek-hyun. I am an administrator from the Utopia Guild. I apologize for the late introduction. The administrator immediately thought of urgently recruiting this guy. Sang-hyun showed the amount that the guild had to pay as compensation. The administrator promised to do so, even though the numbers were frightening. Sang-hyun said he was willing to settle for a symbolic 20 billion, because at first he hadn't thought about the moral damage. But now he realized that 5 billion would not be enough. The administrator didn't even know how to respond, just kept naming the amount and grunting. Meanwhile, Yeon-chul lay in the middle of the courtyard and continued to cry instead of going to change his pants. Voices could be heard from behind the closed door. Someone was ringing the doorbell and waiting for Sang-hyun to open it. The young man did not expect the journalist to arrive so quickly. The journalist wanted to know where Kim Miso was and when the Utopia Guild would pay compensation to the young man from the Eden Guild. Sang-hyun struggled to get to his apartment because there were so many journalists that it was impossible to move freely through the streets. The young man closed the door in front of the reporters, who bombarded him with questions. People wanted to know everything. He couldn't just avoid the questions. He had to answer them. And what else was known about his romance with Kim Miso? The young man simply did not understand why other people needed to know so much about his personal life. In fact, he hadn't even gotten his life in order yet, and they were already attributing a romance to him. Of course, it would be nice if he had a romance, but for that, he needed to prepare. Sang-hyun decided to start by updating his wardrobe and bought everything new, fashionable, and made of high-quality fabrics. In addition, the day finally came to explore the gates that Kim Miso had suggested they study together. Because of this, the entire past week turned into complete chaos. However, the result was worth it. The young man received a very valuable artifact after a deal with Captain Yoon. In addition to everything else, his demon strike had improved after the last battle, and his two-handed sword skills had also gotten better. Many other skills had become more durable, and this was only the beginning. One could imagine how much the young man would gain over time. After that, Sang-hyun analyzed the results of all his training, and he was very pleased with them. Sang-hyun now viewed his performance as something constant and unchanging, and he could count on his strength and luck. However, there were many unfortunate gaps in his recent battles. The young man could not fully reproduce his past experience. Fighting against the Black Wolf, the young man had to take risks due to limitations in his attack style. In the battle with Yeon-chul, Sang-hyun fell into all the traps due to his lack of mobility. In other words, all of his opponents were significantly stronger than him. This time, the young man had to make sure that the future would turn out differently. He couldn't lose all his friends and close players again, with whom he had stood shoulder to shoulder. Sang-hyun had to become stronger and not repeat the mistakes of his past life. The young man wanted to become a different person, strong and capable of changing his life and the lives of those close to him. Sang-hyun really wanted to become like the stranger from his childhood memories who saved the boy, giving him a chance to survive. Shin Sang-hyun was busy planning his next missions. He wanted to find a task that would make him the best player, but suddenly a phone call interrupted his thoughts. It was a call from the well-known reporter Park Jong-min. He reminded him of the interview they had agreed on last week. Today was the day, so the reporter wanted to make sure the player hadn't forgotten. Of course the player had forgotten, but he promised to come immediately and suggested meeting at a restaurant right away. Sang-hyun figured that the gate clearing was scheduled for the evening, so he would be able to do the interview and make it to the raid on time. Sang-hyun quickly got ready and opened the door, but he didn't have time to go anywhere. A crowd of journalists was sitting outside the door. They felt at home here, drinking tea, eating noodles, and waiting for him to come out. Sang-hyun literally went berserk when he heard their questions about the romance. The young man activated his psychedelic skill. His body became stronger, his speed increased significantly, and he barked at all the reporters to leave immediately. Park Jong-min sat in the restaurant waiting for the player he was going to interview. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the noise that swept through the restaurant. Everyone stopped eating and began to look around. The journalist stood up and waved his hand when he saw the player, saying that he had already sat down and ordered coffee. However, Sang-hyun was still furious, and the reporter looked at this strange newcomer with surprise. Park Jong-min noted that the young man looked very tense, but Sang-hyun said that everything was fine. He was just in a bit of a hurry. The reporter suggested that the player had just come out of the dungeon, but the young man denied it, saying that he had only had minor difficulties. In fact, social life was now even more difficult than going to the dungeon. But soon Sang-hyun calmed down and returned to his normal state. He greeted the journalist and apologized for being late. Jung-min said that he had initially requested the interview because of the incident in the quest zone, But then another important event occurred. And now, the more the journalist thought about it, the clearer it became that Shin Sang-hyun was becoming a topic of discussion among players, and all his actions were being scrutinized and monitored by the public. Of course, everyone agrees that rank or skill does not determine a player's level of mastery today, but Sang-hyun was an exception. Despite his low level, he is now called an exceptional newcomer. Sang-hyun said that this was not surprising, but added that now not only reporters, but also all guilds were hunting for him. The young man admitted that he had indeed received many offers, not only from the Eden Guild, but from others as well. In addition, it became known that the fame of the unique rookie had reached foreign guilds. Today's news, which has not yet been broadcast on television, will report that about 5 foreign guilds want to hire Sang-hyun. This morning, they submitted official requests to the Korean Players Association. These overseas guilds gather the strongest players from around the world and try to lure them with bonuses and high salaries. Finally, evening came, and a meeting was arranged in a quiet alley. Sang-hyun kept replaying the reporter's information in his head. The young man wanted to play solo, but the offers from foreign guilds were tempting, as their level of work was very different from that in Korea. Besides, the young man had not forgotten how badly he had been treated before, and how no decent guilds wanted to take him in. At that moment, Kim Miso appeared, and the young man put off thinking about the future until next time. Kim Miso called the young man over and said that they still had time before the raid began. Sang-hyun wasn't really listening to his friend because all his attention was focused on the beautiful stranger standing next to Kim. Kim Miso said that she had brought her friend early so that she could take a quick look at the young man before the raid began. Kim introduced her friend. Her name was Shin Terry, and she also played in the Eden Guild. The girls suggested sitting together in a nearby cafe and chatting. The beautiful blonde held out her hand for a handshake, and the young people exchanged the polite words that are usually said when meeting someone new. Sang-hyun was pleasantly shocked. Although Kim Miso hadn't mentioned the girl, everyone in Korea knew who Shin Terry was, a famous top-class shadow assassin. Sang-hyun was amazed at how many cool people he had met since returning to the past. It was a pity that he hadn't had such an opportunity in his first life. Shin Terry turned to the young man and asked if she could ask him for a favor. Of course, the young man was ready to do anything for the beauty. Terry said that her request was not serious, but she wanted to spar with Sang-hyun. Kim Miso didn't understand why her friend was acting this way, since the young people had only just met. Terry said she had warned her on the way there in the car. Terry reminded her that before approving Sang-hyun's candidacy for the guild, she wanted to test him. Kim Miso had allowed her friend to do so in the car, but now she was trying to say that there was nothing special about it. Sang-hyun replied that he was not opposed in principle and was ready to spar at any time. After that, the young man put his hand on his sword and was ready to draw it. The young man said that it wasn't every day that he was offered a sparring match with one of Korea's best players. It was a great honor for him. Shin Terry thought that her friend had an eye for good people and professionals. The girl apologized to Sang-hyun for being a little harsh at the beginning of their acquaintance. Shin Terry offered to show only 5 moves and was ready to wait until the young man was ready. Sang-hyun saw that Terry had begun to activate her abilities. He realized that he had almost no chance. But it was a great opportunity to practice and also to test how far he had progressed and where his weaknesses remained. The girl was the only one who chose a weapon, and from that moment on, her aura changed completely in a matter of seconds. Sang-hyun understood that there would be no leniency this time. The young man activated his psychedelic skill and said he was ready to spar. Sang-hyun decided to give it his all from the start. Kim Miso watched what was happening, realizing that she couldn't keep up with the developments and that something serious could happen between them. Shin Terry stepped forward and said it was time to start with the first move. Suddenly, everything spun in the air, and the girl disappeared as if she had dissolved into space. Sang-hyun watched closely, but he didn't manage to notice where his opponent had gone. However, in the next moment, he received a powerful blow and realized that with his current level of physical fitness, his reaction was too slow. But he managed to raise his long sword at the last moment, and Terry stabbed him with 2 daggers. Sang-hyun understood that he needed to anticipate her movements and react in advance. The girl struck again, but the guy handled it well. Terry announced that there were 4 more moves left. She began to strike and move at tremendous speed, while Sang-hyun simply watched, trying to figure out the pattern of her movements. As expected, the girl showed incredible movements, only accelerating without slowing down. Sang-hyun closed his eyes. He understood that his vision was not fast enough to control Shin Terry, but he had experience fighting without visual analysis. He had to read his opponent's movements through his senses. Of course, the situation was now many times more complicated, and Kim Miso was simply stunned when she saw that Sang-hyun had closed his eyes. It seemed crazy, even for such a unique novice. Closing his eyes in such a situation was risky. But the young man had moved to another level and seemed to have transformed from an ordinary person into a ghost. Sang-hyun used his inner senses and, understanding the risk, sensed the moment to strike. The young man dodged at that very moment, and Terry missed her strike. The girl was amazed by his impressive concentration. Terry honestly admitted that she did not expect Sang-hyun to block her second strike. Most masters cannot achieve this level of control. Shin Terry understood that it was not a matter of talent, but of experience. And that was indeed the case. The girl noted that the novice behaved like a veteran, but Sang-hyun said she shouldn't flatter him. Terry announced that there were 3 moves left, But before continuing, Sang Hyun wanted to ask something. After the girl gave her permission, the young man continued. He suggested that instead of demonstrating the 3 techniques one by one, they try to show them all at once. The girl thought she had misheard him and even asked him to repeat himself. Son Young confirmed that the idea sounded presumptuous, but he didn't want to miss such an opportunity. The young man added please, asking to see everything Shin Tae-ri had in her arsenal just once. He understood that if he couldn't handle her full potential, he wouldn't be able to grow after that moment. But then Kim Miso intervened. She was categorically against such an idea. Shin Tae-ri said that she wouldn't be completely serious anyway, since they hadn't activated training mode, but she was ready to show a high-speed strike. This option suited Sang Hyun, because it was Terry's own high-speed strike. The guy was glad that the girl took him seriously, and she promised to act as if it were a real fight. Terry got ready and soon rushed into the attack, warning her opponent that she was going to attack. Sang Hyun immediately realized that time was short and that he had to be fully prepared. Otherwise, he would not survive. He had to act in advance instead of swinging his sword and making meaningless movements. He had to be in the right place before his opponent revealed himself. Sang Hyun had to move as if he was the first to attack his opponent. Shin Tae-ri suddenly felt the young man's sword near her head and immediately activated the Shadow Mirage skill. After that, the girl jumped up and struck Sang Hyun in the face with the hilt of her sword. All the spectators were alarmed and looked at Sanyeon with pity and concern. The young man did not turn to them, but said he was fine, even though he was thinking about how Terry had promised not to use that skill. He felt a terrible headache, as if he had hit his forehead. Shin Tae-ri rushed to him and began apologizing for the blow. Sang Hyun assured her that he was fine and considered it an honor that she had fought him with all her strength. Terry said she felt the same way, and Sang Hyun was surprised by her words. She added that next time they would have a chance to talk properly. After that, they shook hands, both happy, while Kim Miso did not quite approve of what was happening. Kim Miso took her friend by the arm and said that the raid would start any minute. Kim Miso said that today they had to write a report for Giryadia, so they wouldn't be able to meet, and, of course, the girl wanted to add that her friend had behaved completely recklessly today. Shin Tae-ri said goodbye to the guys, wishing them luck on Lady, and asked them to write as soon as they were free. Sang Hyun felt frustrated. It was his first defeat since he returned to the past. If Shin Tae-ri had fought at full strength from the start, the young man would not have survived a single move. Unexpectedly, he realized what he would strive for. Shin Tae-ri gave the young man a very interested and thoughtful look as she said goodbye. Sang Hyun read this look as a suggestion to try to surpass the beauty in his skill. Be that as it may, the players finally gathered near the unidentified gate not far from Chunui Station. Kim Miso was the only one who knew all the members of the group. She greeted Redak and suggested they get acquainted first. Kim pointed to 2 players, a guy and a girl, who would be clearing the unfamiliar dungeon together with Kim and Sang Hyun. Sang Hyun was thrilled and acted very sincerely. He introduced himself and said that he was very lucky to have such serious and cool guys on his team. The guy's name was Park Tae-sok. He was a mage and mainly specialized in fire spells. Incendiary spells are all kinds of ways to use fire, roughly the same as what he had used the day before in his battle with the fat man, Yunkyul. But Pak had some other interesting features as well. It was not for nothing that he was a member of the Eden Guild. The young man devoted most of his playing time to mastering his flame skills, so his firepower was bound to be higher than that of ordinary players. He demonstrated a cold blue fire that rose high into the sky, emanating directly from his palms. Park was now at the stage of using blue flames, but of course, there were still many things he needed to work on. Sang Hyun praised his skills and said that he looked quite capable. The young man himself thought it was very smart to focus on one thing until his skills stabilized. During the battle with Yunchul, Sang Hyun was able to defeat him so easily for the same reason. Instead of focusing on one thing, the fat man took a little bit of everything, and this weakened him in everything. In other words, he was not a master at anything. Next, it was time to introduce a girl who looked like a very young girl. It was Kang Joo-hee, a spatial ability user. That is, a mage who specialized in spatial connection. Since Tae-sok had demonstrated his abilities, the girl decided not to be outdone and also show a little of what she could do. Kim tried to stop her friend, realizing that it would not lead to anything good. Sang Hyun felt a sudden gust of wind. He didn't understand what spatial communication was because there was nothing but wind. But suddenly, some kind of magic happened, and right in front of the young man appeared a huge residential area with streets and houses, and it seemed as if the guy was looking at it all from above. This was the girl's ability. She could create illusions and make them so believable that people did not doubt their reality. Kang bowed her head low to Sang Hyun and asked him to take care of her and protect her while they were going through the dungeon. Sang Hyun felt that it was his responsibility to show attention and respect to the team members. As expected, Kim Miso had assembled a very good and balanced group. Sang Hyun was responsible for close combat, while Kim Miso provided long-range fire support. Tae-sok filled in any gaps in combat power, and Kang Joo-hee was able to create tactical variations. If we forget that the group didn't have a healer, the team was perfect. But that wasn't even the main thing. The main point was that the players were compatible and had a friendly atmosphere. They understood each other perfectly. It was clear that they had fought together many times before with this lineup. Knowing your teammates helps you survive even better than a good strategy just like it used to be in Shin Sang-hyun's past life. The guy thought for a moment about the people with whom he had come a long way, but unfortunately, he had lost Kim. She noticed that the young man was pensive and sad. She was worried that Sang-hyun might have been traumatized after the battle with Shin Tae. Perhaps they should pay attention to him before they entered the gate. Sang-hyun thanked her for her concern and said that he was fine, just lost in thought for a second. The young man understood that it was time to let go of the past. So, the team was ready and it was time to go inside. Once inside, they needed to think less about what had happened and more about what was happening right now. The unidentified gate led the group of players into an icy hell. The entire area was mountainous and covered with a layer of snow. In addition, it was snowing at that moment. The players moved slowly deeper into the territory, looking around and assessing the situation. Sang-hyun remembered something and thanked his new friend Park Tae-sok. Sang-hyun admitted that without his buff, he would have frozen to death long ago, but the fiery blessing skill increased his resistance. Kim said that it wasn't so cold on the last expedition, but everyone agreed that Tae-sok was very useful now, keeping everyone warm. Kim asked if Sang-hyun had any other weapons besides his two-handed sword, and if so, why he didn't use them. Sang-hyun replied that for this raid, he would need a more mobile approach to combat, so he chose something suitable. Kim was surprised that the young man could use multiple weapons. Usually, a swordmaster sticks to only one. Sang-hyun admitted that he had wanted to do this from the beginning, but he was just too lazy to come up with an excuse. Kim wanted to ask Joo-hee something else when suddenly a loud growl sounded. The sound came from a huge one-eyed goblin that had just appeared near the players. The guys immediately froze. Kim Miso ordered them to follow the plan. Joo-hee immediately got involved. She knew what this meant and began to create her spatial illusions. The goblin rushed to attack the players, but was met with a powerful explosion that blocked his path. Sang-hyun and Kim prepared their weapons and approached their opponent from behind. Kim said she was waiting for instructions from her comrade, thus handing the initiative in the battle to Sang-hyun. The player was very pleased. In that case, he ordered her to provide covering fire while he was going to destroy this goblin solo. By this point, the goblin had already noticed the players approaching from above and behind. Park Tae-sok activated his blue fire, which was now aimed directly at the monster's head, and the goblin looked in surprise at the approaching blue flame. The fire hit the monster right in the head. Sang-hyun approached the goblin at the same time, while Kim stayed at a distance, preparing her bow and drawing her arrows. Sang-hyun took advantage of the monster's blindness and riddled its body with arrows, leaving the goblin looking like a piece of meat studded with holes. At that moment, it was Kang Joo-hee's turn to join the battle. The girl was already ready and her illusion went to its destination. Meanwhile, the goblin approached Sang-hyun and stretched out his huge hand, intending to grab the boy. At the last moment, the giant slammed his palm down on the player so hard that pieces of stone and ice flew everywhere. The goblin was sure that Sang-hyun was crushed and pinned under his palm, and now there was one less enemy. But Sang-hyun was not in the monster's palm. He jumped up from behind and whispered in the goblin's ear, "Did you really think you won?" Tae-sok and Joo-hee continued to work their magic and prepared for the next attack. Sang-hyun activated Demon Strike, and for a moment the huge goblin froze in place, completely motionless. The young man did not delay the end of the battle for long. He swung his sword and cut off the head of the huge monster. It all happened so fast that Tae-sok and Joo-hee didn't even have time to move or react. Sang-hyun finally jumped to the ground, saying that this time he even had to exert himself a little. But then the player was showered with accusations. After all, they hadn't agreed on this from the start. When drawing up the battle plan, it was not said that the killing would be carried out with a single blow. Sang-hyun apologized to the guys for acting on his own. Kim said that the young man should not apologize. It was something very unusual. That was exactly what the girl had told her friends about. Kim admitted that she had the same reaction the first time she watched Sang-hyun fight. Kim went on to say that even Sang-hyun hadn't used his full strength and hadn't shown his true abilities. Sang-hyun thought that after these words, he would have to show his full potential. Besides, the guy didn't understand why Kim was praising him so much. In any case, there was excellent coordination between the players, especially considering that it was their first time working together. That's what experienced players are all about. In fact, it was all very promising, and now they could move further into the dungeon. The players decided it was time to start the second round. Just then, goblins began to emerge from the forest. They were gigantic, taller than the ancient trees. These goblins suffered the same fate, and soon the white snow was stained with the purple blood of the goblins. Park Tae-sok was a sincere guy and didn't want to hold back Sang-hyun. He called him an incredible and amazing player, the best the mage had ever played with. Sang-hyun, of course, felt proud. He was very pleased and even somewhat embarrassed to receive such warm words. Kim Miso said that the young man should get used to it. The fact was that they didn't even have to use magic, because thanks to the swordsman, Tae-sok used his skills at will, and that made him absolutely happy. Without a reliable swordmaster, a group of players usually relies on a good mage to cast support spells. But this is not easy, because a good mage is not easy to find, just like any other professional. Kim Miso, in order to distract the mage and calm him down, asked Sang-hyun what skills he had used. The girl wanted to know, because she should have gotten used to it by now, but Sang-hyun continued to surprise her again and again. At that moment, the snowy Arctic forest shook, and a loud growl swept through it. All the players immediately got ready. The mage connected, and the swordsman and archer also froze, waiting for the enemy to approach. A huge crowd of orcs ran towards the players at high speed. They were armed with clubs and axes and were also wearing armor. Kim and Taesok shouted that there were armed demon orcs ahead. The players didn't have time to figure out what to do, because the monsters took them by surprise. They needed to concentrate all their firepower, but first and foremost, Kim Miso wanted to keep her distance. Sang Hyun turned to Juhee and asked her to open a portal that would take him straight to the main demon orc. Kim shouted that he was focused on defense, so there was no need to do that. But at the same time, she understood that Sang Hyun had something in mind and had already prepared a plan. At times like this, she just had to trust this strange and amazing guy. Kim Miso ordered Juhee to do as she was asked. The orc demon was already very close and raised his hand with an axe, preparing to strike. Juhee activated her abilities and opened the portal that Sang Hyun had requested. The young man immediately rushed into the portal, activating the full charge skill. This skill allowed him to instantly charge up with powerful energy and throw the player forward, striking the enemy. The members of the player team saw that Sang Hyun was no longer in front of them. The young man had dived into the open portal. Accelerating with a full charge skill, the player rushed straight into the head of a huge monstrous monster. No one understood or noticed what happened next. Even the orc demon did not see his killer. He only managed to roar loudly one last time. Kim Miso and Park Taesok stood there, stunned by what they had seen. They didn't even try to understand what it was called or where the young man had learned all these skills. Sang Hyun smiled happily at his companions. He was pleased that he had managed to realize his idea. Later, as the group walked through the dungeon, Kim Miso said that it was a mobility skill, but she had never seen it used so powerfully. Sang Hyun confirmed that he had used it a little more aggressively because he completely trusted his team. At that moment, Kang Juhee ordered everyone to be very quiet. She had heard some strange sounds. The players crept to the edge of the rocky plateau, lay down on it, and looked down. It became clear that they had already reached their destination. Below on the lower plateau, a huge monster lay in the snow. It seemed to be sleeping peacefully and snoring. It was the mid-boss, Cerberus of the Ice Hell. Kim Miso told the guys that they didn't have enough information about this boss and that maybe they should prepare a few portals. Sang Hyun said he had a plan and that perhaps they should start with his rainfire, which he was ready to use. The fact was that the young man had already obtained a special effect by this time and believed that it was the perfect time to use it. This effect allowed the player to recover very quickly during the night inside the dungeon, increase the speed and power of their actions, and also cause monsters and wolves to freeze for a certain amount of time. In short, the players had to move on to the plan, but then Kim Miso noticed that Sang Hyun was hardly listening to her. The young man stood with his eyes closed and seemed to be somewhere else. Kim asked what he was doing right now. Sang Hyun opened his eyes and said he was ready to start the fight. This strange expression greatly alarmed his companions. The guys already understood that things would not go according to plan. They wanted to know at least roughly what direction the battle would take. Sang Hyun didn't want to waste time on unnecessary chatter and said that the guys just needed to watch, and they would understand everything themselves. The players weren't going to argue with him, but they wanted to hear an explanation. However, there was no time to explain because at that moment, the full moon appeared in the sky. To activate a special effect called Time of the Dog and the Wolf, the moon had to be clearly visible. Even if it was hidden behind clouds, only half of the effect would work. Sang Hyun apologized to his companions, said he didn't have time, and rushed to attack the middle boss. The young man jumped down near Cerberus, and the huge three-headed wolf woke up and growled menacingly. Sang Hyun already understood that it was always easier to ask for forgiveness than to wait for permission, so he did not wait for support from the players and was going to fight Cerberus solo. Sang Hyun looked at the three-headed monster. It was hideous, with huge toothy mouths dripping with saliva and horns on each head. Kim Miso was the first to come to her senses and told the others that they should be ready to cover for Sang Hyun if necessary. Juhee couldn't take her eyes off the enemy because it all looked very strange. Cerberus didn't react to the player at all. Kim Miso also watched what was happening and confirmed that the girl was right. Perhaps Cerberus was just being cautious and studying the enemy. But that was probably not the case, because the last time the players encountered Cerberus, he was aggressive from the start. The players didn't understand what was going on. They continued to watch their opponent, but they still had to stop staring and prepare themselves in case their help was needed. Kim Miso watched Cerberus intently and suddenly realized that his posture was not one of attack. Soon it became clear to everyone because the giant three-headed monster crouched in a submissive pose before Sang Hyun. Cerberus of the Icy Hell saw the player as a high-ranking creature and entered a state of intelligent submission. Sang Hyun realized that Cerberus was a complete cutie, and now the player was going to deal with him very quickly. Within a few minutes, a message appeared confirming that the mid-level boss named Cerberus of the Ice Hell had been defeated. Sang Hyun was torn by conflicting feelings. The young man felt uncomfortable killing someone who had completely submitted. However, if he didn't do it, the players wouldn't be able to move on. After destroying Cerberus, the young man received the title Estranga. With its help, he could reduce the recharge time of any skill. Sang Hyun decided to use this reduction for recovery so that he could now restore his physical strength very quickly. At this point, the players had already descended from the plateau and approached Sang Hyun. Kim Miso wanted to talk very much, and the girl looked quite angry. Sang Hyun really disliked being distracted while doing what he loved most, working with statuses and new effects. Soon everything lit up, and a magic stone appeared, which made the young man think. After all, he had never discussed with his teammates how the loot would be distributed. The young man had been clearing the area solo for so long that he made a big mistake when he tried to take the trophy for himself. However, he really didn't want to share it with anyone. Kim Miso confirmed to the guy that he had defeated Cerberus alone, so the reward was entirely his. Sang Hyun thanked the girl with relief, considering this option to be correct and fair. However, he wanted to know what the other players would say about this. No one had any complaints or hard feelings. Of course, the guys thought that the trophy should go to Sang Hyun because he did everything on his own, and they didn't even have to participate in the slightest. Sang Hyun thanked the guys again for their understanding, but he thought to himself that he needed to urgently get rid of his habit of talking about the trophy first and trying to take it for himself. After the issue of the award was settled, the players decided to step aside, while Sang Hyun would stay and go about his usual business. Sang Hyun asked what they meant by those words. Kim Miso replied that every time he got an artifact, Sang Hyun was afraid to even imagine what the players meant by it. Kim Miso didn't want to say it out loud, but admitted that she had actually known about everything for a long time. Right after the guys cleared the quest area for the first time, the girl said she would leave first because she needed to call the porters. And she really was going to leave first because she had nothing to do there. But at the last moment, Kim Miso turned around to look at this unusual player and saw what he was doing. Kim Miso saw and learned the guy's secret. Sang Hyun was alarmed and dissatisfied. He realized that the day had come after all, and very quickly. Sang Hyun knew that his unique skill was literally a lifeline for a player, but now it would be made public, and the guy was absolutely unhappy and dissatisfied with that. Sang Hyun was a player who performed some kind of incomprehensible ritual every time. Of course, this was not uncommon. Every player had their own quirks, so there was no need to be shy, and you could let yourself go. Of course, you wanted to keep such a moment and peculiarity a secret. Juhi was very alarmed. She did not expect Sang Hyun to be so dependent on rituals, but she still had to respect the guy's personal boundaries. Sun Hyung was shocked when he realized what a monstrous misunderstanding had occurred, but the young man decided that it was better than if the truth had been hidden, because information about his ability to eat artifacts could lead to big problems. In any case, the young man was now ready to devour an artifact called the Heart of Ice. This heart contained the extreme cold of an icy hell, seeking to freeze the entire world. After that, the players went deeper into the territory in search of the main enemy, because the dungeon still hadn't been cleared. Kang Joo-hee created another portal, saying that it was the last one and that the players could move forward. Kim thanked the girl, saying that she had done an excellent job and that thanks to these portals, the players were able to get out alive and unharmed. Sang Hyun also admired the illusion created by the girl and thanked her for her work. Kang Joo-hee, even though she did everything the guy explained to her, wasn't sure it would work. Even if she piled up the corpses of all those the players had defeated earlier, there was no complete certainty. After all, no one could guarantee that the main boss would definitely come to this pile to devour his slain comrades. Sang Hyun asked his companions not to doubt him. The young man knew that this boss would eat any meat. They just had to wait. Of course, a counter question immediately arose. How did the guy know this? And where did he get such information? But luckily for Sang Hyun, he didn't have to answer. He ordered Tae-sok to urgently light the fire to lure the final boss here. All the players sat in ambush and waited for the monster to appear. The worst thing for any warrior is waiting, because in such moments, doubts and self-doubt arise. Sang Hyun reassured the guys, saying that it didn't matter how much time had passed. The final boss could appear at any moment and take the bait. And just then, someone let out a loud roar. And luckily for the players who were dying of anticipation, the final boss of this area appeared. Kim Miso ordered everyone to be on alert and act according to the circumstances in the previously discussed plan. The monster was truly gigantic. Its muzzle alone looked bigger than the nearest rock behind which the players were hiding. The players watched with bated breath as the giant gradually emerged from behind the mountain. The final boss was called the Ice Grizzly. Kim Miso looked down from the top of the rock and thought that thanks to Sang Hyun's plan, the group had been able to easily defeat all the monsters up to this point. But now it was clear that the situation could be a dead end because the opponents were too different in strength and power. Now, looking at the difference in their sizes, it seemed that the battle was already decided and the Ice Grizzly would surely win. The final boss of the dungeon was quite enraged. He looked at the player, preparing to devour him in the next few minutes. Sang Hyun was going to fight the monster. Thanks to Tae-sok's magical abilities, the young man did not feel the cold. But still, the guy had a crazy thought that the situation might be too dangerous for him. A few minutes before the final monster appeared, the players once again tried to come up with a plan of action. Sang Hyun explained his vision of the situation, but Kim Miso couldn't believe that he was really suggesting what he had just said. Sang Hyun wanted to use himself as bait because he believed there was no other way out. If the players wanted to clear the dungeon quickly and safely, this was the best option. All giant monsters and final bosses have something in common. They always react the same way when their health bar is depleted. Final bosses fall into a state of so-called devouring. In this state, monsters become physically stronger and much more violent. They tend to devour everything around them, which is why it was necessary to stack the goblin corpses as bait. And now Sang-hyun proposed the main feature of the plan. He was going to make bait with a special filling. Kang Joo-hee collected corpses throughout the dungeon and brought them to one place through the portal, while the rest of the group gathered juniper wood, which is a powerful anesthetic in itself. This juniper was to be spread out along with the goblin corpses. But there was one small problem. They needed to wear the monster down to the point of devouring. Sang-hyun agreed that it was necessary to create the right conditions so that all the players could attack without fear. The young man was going to take on this role, once again asking his friends to trust him. And now as he ran, trying to escape from the ice grizzly, Sang-hyun suddenly wondered if he had been too hasty. The guy had just been a step away from death, even though he was much more experienced than before. Sang-hyun believed he could withstand some of the ice grizzly's blows, and now he had a normal defense tactic. However, the ice grizzly was monstrously strong. Sang-hyun was struggling and didn't understand if his strength stats were really insufficient. This would have continued, and the young man could have actually died, even after returning to the past to live his best life. Sang-hyun decided that he would not endure the monster's blows, but would only dodge them. It soon became clear that dodging didn't always work either. The ice grizzly was very fast. Sang-hyun decided to use a jump to reach the monster's head and slash it with his sword. But the monster immediately raised its muzzle, and now this jump was not such a good decision. At the last moment, Kim Miso came to the rescue, shooting arrows into the ice grizzly's snout, preventing it from swallowing the young man. Sang-hyun took advantage of the fact that the giant bear had lowered its muzzle. Kim Miso was about to shoot a few more arrows and warned the young man about it. Sang-hyun thanked the girl in midair, saying that it was thanks to her help that he had survived this time. Sang-hyun activated Full Charge. It was one of his favorite skills. The young man began striking the ice grizzly with his sword. Soon, the place that had been cut began to be covered with ice. The grizzly was frozen thanks to the effect of Full Charge. Sang-hyun was very pleased with the result. The young man had obtained this freezing skill from the Ice Heart and also combined it with Full Charge. It seemed that nothing would work, but the combination was successful. After all his previous actions, Sang-hyun felt confident again and said that his time had come. The player plunged his sword into the body of the ice grizzly. The final boss was clearly annoyed. Part of his body was covered in ice, and blood was pouring from his leg. At that moment, Sang-hyun activated the Demon Strike skill, and it was time for Magu Taesak to join the battle. The young man created the largest and most powerful discharge of fire energy. This skill, a blue fire flamingo, was so powerful that it could destroy everything in its path. Sang-hyun barely avoided colliding with it. The ice grizzly was seriously damaged and flew a long distance as a result of the blow. The mage's firepower exceeded all expectations. Sang-hyun silently thanked his colleague, believing that the players had now surely reached the boss's required health mark. At first glance, it seemed that the ice grizzly was already dead. The monster lay on the ground with its mouth open and its tongue hanging out. Suddenly, the energy around the grizzly bear began to change. It snapped its bloody jaws shut and let out a loud roar. This sound was like balm to Sang-hyun's ears. He had confirmation that the players had dealt enough damage and that their idea was working. The grizzly bear entered a state of devouring. Everything was going smoothly. Kim Miso watched the monster closely, sensing that something was wrong. But the bear began to devour everything around it. Its gaze was completely insane, like a nighttime binge for any human being. Sang-hyun also looked at the ice grizzly and didn't understand why the effect and state of devouring were accompanied by such cruelty. At that moment, Kang Joo-hee was supposed to join the battle, but now the final boss looked like a completely different monster. Kim Miso didn't understand where the girl was and why she hadn't started her part of the operation yet, because it would be very difficult for Sang-hyun to withstand such a fierce opponent. Taesuk said that the girl was still preparing. Indeed, Kang Joo-hee was standing in front of the portal she had created, doing something incomprehensible. Kim Miso asked her companion if the girl would be able to finish the portal in time, but Taesuk had no answer to that question. He preferred not to think about the worst. Right now, it was more important to determine whether Sang-hyun could hold out in the battle with Grizzly until help arrived. Sang-hyun was no longer trying to strike back. He just hoped he would have enough strength to at least run away from the ferocious monster. The young man understood that if Kang Joo-hee wasn't ready yet, he would die right here and now. At some point, he realized that everything would be decided right here, and he would not be able to dodge the attack. Sang-hyun realized that he had to accept the fight and decided to attack head-on. At the same time, the young man activated the psychedelic skill. Finally, a huge portal was created, and the girl announced that she was ready. Kang Joo-hee prepared herself and began to initiate the deformation. While it was unclear how this would affect the course of the battle, the ice grizzly was just about to swallow Sang-hyun. The deformation caused the space in the dungeon to begin to change. Now the young man could not control himself. The players rushed to Joo-hee, who was sitting exhausted on the ground with her eyes closed. They were worried about her well-being. The girl said she was fine. She had just used up too much mana. Sang-hyun felt that death had been too close this time. Sang-hyun watched the final boss devouring the goblins' bodies and thought that he could have just fallen into that merciless, insatiable mouth. The big grizzly bear, along with the goblin bodies, was heavily anesthetized by the Snow Mountain juniper. This was exactly the effect the players had hoped for. The guys didn't hold back their emotions. Everything had worked out, and they hugged each other with tears of joy and satisfaction from a job well done. Finally, the bear finished gorging itself and now stood at full height, bleeding profusely, but still as ferocious and merciless as ever. But he didn't stand like that for long. His eyes began to roll back, and victory over the final boss was declared. The monster fell, and pieces of ice and stone flew in all directions from the fall. A notification came that the unidentified gate called Ice Hell had been completely cleared. Kim Miso admitted that the players relied on him too much, and it was starting to bother her. But Sang-hyun tried to say that he had insisted and left the guys no choice. But then the most pleasant part of the clearing began. Sang-hyun received a notification that his levels had increased significantly. Of course, they had to work hard in this dungeon. There were many dangerous moments, but everyone did a great job. San-young thanked Kim Miso once again for believing in his plan. The girl said that she also discovered the limits of her abilities, so she didn't lose out. Sang-hyun was pleased and said he was counting on her next time. Of course, it was strange because the guy preferred solo missions, but this time he was really grateful to the guys for their trust. Sang-hyun, however, was sure that he had reached the end anyway. But now the players could safely leave the gate. In the past, the young man had encountered such gates and missions that always ended very tragically. The average survival rate of the gates he sought because of the good rewards was 90%. Since the raid was conducted with the participation of non-professionals, the survival rate was very high. But despite this, there were still many possibilities and opportunities to lose one's life. After all, someone will still become part of that statistical 10%. And you can never predict in advance who will end up on this sad list and never leave the playing field again. Unfortunately, players constantly face death. Growth is important, of course, but it is even more important to prevent unnecessary casualties. And now, thanks to his new company, Sang-hyun certainly didn't earn as much as he would have for a solo cleanup. But everyone was alive and almost healthy. At that moment, an announcement came about the reward that all the players had been working so hard for. Everyone watched eagerly, not knowing what to expect. A huge red fireball appeared nearby. It was a special reward for the first time. Sang-hyun was happy to receive such an award. It was his first time. As soon as a player touched the award, they would immediately be rewarded. Sang-hyun reached out his hand toward the prize, but then he felt someone else's hand touch his. It was the goddess of luck, who said that now the young man would be able to see her true power. Sang-hyun was intrigued and really wanted to see the true power of the goddess of fortune, who was smiling sweetly. Now everything became even more interesting, and the young man boldly reached for the reward. A notification announced that player Shin Sang-hyun had been rewarded with a unique artifact. And not just any artifact. The young man could choose one from the list provided. Of course, the guy hoped that the reward would be cool, but he didn't even expect to receive a unique artifact. The young man made his choice and was just as tired from it as he was from clearing the dungeon. It became known that thanks to the power of the goddess of luck, the artifact would have a hidden effect that would be unlocked and absorbed in the future. This was a pleasant bonus stipulated in the contract with the goddess of luck. From that moment on, the goddess of luck asked Sang-hyun to call her his older sister, or simply Goddess Nuna. All the players were busy choosing their rewards, so Sang-hyun hoped that no one noticed what bonuses he had chosen. The guy couldn't believe his luck until the very end, because he had never had such a pleasant and responsible task in his life. The young man decided not to be modest and chose a two-handed sword. He had dreamed of this artifact for a very long time, and now he had become its owner. The Battle Spirit's two-handed sword was a unique artifact. It possessed not only enormous power, but also the hidden blessing of the wind. Unique artifacts were always the coolest, and their stats were absolutely insane. Sang-hyun decided that from now on he would rely on this sword and took hold of its hilt. But the weapon turned out to be monstrously heavy. Sang-hyun couldn't even hold it with his arm outstretched. The young man did not understand why the sword was so heavy and why the lightning effect did not work. He began to read about the lightning effect and discovered that when a large amount of mana was consumed, the lightning effect was reduced as a penalty. This was, of course, a jerk move. Kim Miso approached the young man and asked how he was doing, because he was acting strangely. The young man replied that everything was fine and that he now had something very cool. All the other players were also happy. They received artifacts suitable for their class, and all thanks to Sang-hyun. Sang-hyun started saying again that he hadn't done anything, but Kim Miso asked him not to be modest. It was an indisputable fact. The guys had received all of today's bonuses thanks to Sang-hyun. The girl continued, saying that the players had discussed it among themselves and decided on something. They were unanimously ready to give all their byproducts, such as the boss's corpse and magic stones, to one player, and that player was Shin Sang-hyun. The young man began to refuse, saying that they shouldn't give such gifts, but Kang Joo-hee said that she had already calculated everything clearly, taking into account the contribution of each player, so there was no need to worry. Everything was very honest and fair. Sang-hyun didn't hold back his tears and just lowered his head, wiping his eyes. The young man knew that the monster corpses alone were worth a lot of money, and if you added the side products, it would be a fabulous amount. The players were ready to cry along with him. They thought the young man was crying out of gratitude and emotion. Sang-hyun calculated the huge numbers in his head and was pleased with the outcome. After crying their hearts out and receiving their bonuses, the players left the gates of Ice Hell. Kim Miso invited the young man to celebrate the successful raid with the company and join them for dinner. But Sang-hyun declined, saying that he preferred to go rest and promised to celebrate with them next time. The guy couldn't wait to check the results. He wished the guys a good time and thanked them for their quality teamwork. Kim Miso, not having had time to walk away, returned and asked if it would be considered rude if she started communicating with him more informally. The young man replied that she was a better player, so he should ask if it was okay to talk to a senior player informally. Kim Miso smiled, because that was indeed the case. She wished the young man a safe journey home and called him Appa. Sang-hyun also wished the girl well, but thought about how long it had been since he had heard the word Appa, which means close friend, addressed to him. Taesak and Joo-hee felt a little uncomfortable because there was a romantic vibe in the air. It is unknown what other changes await the young man in the near future. Finally alone, Sang-hyun could do what he loved most. The young man began to devour the two-handed sword, and literally before his eyes, the weapon gradually disappeared. It all happened very quickly. As expected, since there were no bonus stats for the two-handed sword, it didn't take long to absorb. After that, Sang-hyun activated the lightning effect, and he could proceed to the next improvement. It was time to take stock and study the information about the player. In principle, it made the young man very happy. Sang-hyun received the rank of Smart Hunter, thanks to which his health was restored after defeating a monster. Simply switching to a two-handed sword significantly increased the player's strength. If he could also increase his luck stage, then the player's condition would become as comfortable as possible. Sang-hyun understood that he had risen very high, much faster than in his previous life. This time, he could count on luck in almost any situation. The guy believed that it would continue this way. He would only grow and soon get the demon sword, catching up with the best players. But suddenly, the young man felt that the atmosphere around him was becoming increasingly ominous. Sang-hyun was calculating when he would be able to get his revenge on Shin-tae, but some lighter color caught his attention. It all reminded him of something, but the player couldn't remember what. He was too absorbed in his thoughts. 3 constellations came to the young man again. The Lion King, who was very interested in him, as well as the possessor of Beauty and Flame. But the Dark Reaper made the strongest impression on Sang-hyun. The girl wanted to get the player, believing that he should belong to her. Sang-hyun didn't even know how to react to the arrival of these unexpected guests, but the Goddess of Fortune said that this time, several good constellations had appeared. This meant that the player's level was rising, and he was becoming more and more interesting to others, because the constellations already understood and sensed his abilities. Sang-hyun was definitely pleased. He didn't expect the next batch of constellations to appear so soon, but it was probably because his experience was also growing very quickly. And of course, we mustn't forget that the Goddess of Fortune was very popular. One had to admire her gorgeous Goddess of Fortune. Sang-hyun decided to check who came to him first today. It turned out to be the Lion King, as well as the possessor of Beauty and Flame. There were no constellations more popular than these two. They were real people, but over time, they were counted among the constellations. However, now these constellations were dissatisfied. The Lion King scolded the player for looking up to his superiors. The possessor of Beauty and Flame shouted that if he were among the generals, the player would have been punished long ago for his behavior. It is precisely because former heroes are the same people that they always cause a lot of trouble. But this time, someone else very dangerous appeared. The Dark Reaper was the last character a player would want to meet. She constantly monitors spatial strips in real time and roams the area, tracking players who receive additional bonuses due to matrix glitches. They say she is a bounty hunter who is always on the trail of players who commit serious violations of the rules. In a previous life, the player had such an experience. Except for special situations, such as a contract with the Goddess of Fortune, a player who signed 2 contracts at once became a target for the Dark Reaper. She mercilessly tormented him until he finally broke down. Sang-hyun broke out in a sweat from the tension. In fact, he didn't need any of these constellations, although the Lion King increased endurance and the possessor of Beauty and Flame could add strength. Of course, contracts with constellations were always very important for players, but this decision could almost completely change Sang-hyun's entire future. At this stage, it was enough for him to have his own constellation, the Goddess of Fortune. This meant that the player had to wait a little and not choose from today's constellations. After all, in the future, he may encounter someone even more powerful from the divine world. Only a few players in history have signed contracts with one of these constellations. They were truly mythical creatures. Of course, the player did not like to take risks, but he had no other choice. The young man apologized to the constellations and said that he would not change his mind and choose any of them for now. The Lion King was offended, and the possessor of Beauty and Flame said that he might visit the young man again. But Sang-hyun was sure that his answer would not change, even if they returned twice. The Dark Reaper's reaction was the most surprising. The constellation had already almost entered the gate. But then the Dark Reaper turned, looked at the young man, and said that one day she would reveal his secret. After that, all the constellations disappeared. The gate closed and dissolved into thin air. Sang-hyun was very upset. Such situations were exhausting. He really wanted to avoid a quarrel, but it seemed that there was no way around it. The young man decided not to think about it anymore, took out his phone, and figured out if now was the right time for his next move. The thing was, there were monsters in the next rift, a group of kobolds. They were similar to Cerberus, but much rarer and also susceptible to the effect of the Hour of the Dog and Wolf. Sang-hyun couldn't pass up such an opportunity, knowing that the prey would be easy, but this was already his third battle in one day. Of course, it wasn't easy to fight so many times, but Sang-hyun decided to give it a try. He would keep trying until the divine place took an interest in them. The young man went to the quest zone, which was located near the Jumpsill station. At the Players Association, in the Rift office, work continued at this time. Managers were monitoring the situation. The secretary greeted the caller and promised to connect him to the subscriber. The girl couldn't believe her ears. Such an unusual caller had called her. But suddenly, a danger signal appeared on the map. A fault had formed near the Gupyeong station. Everyone had to be on alert immediately. A general mobilization was announced. The girl shouted into the phone that confirmation had been received and that the association was recruiting the nearest players. But the caller said that a battle was already underway and someone was fighting in the rift. Of course, that couldn't be. The woman on the phone said that there was one player. It was completely unclear how he got there, but he was killing monsters all by himself. The secretary from the Players Association warned the woman that it was too dangerous to be there and asked civilians to get as far away as possible. At that time, Shin Sang-hyun was destroying the monsters with an axe he had borrowed from them, claiming that it wasn't really that dangerous there. And indeed, the heads of wolves and other monsters flew in all directions. The rift between the worlds was formed 11 years ago after the first rupture. Unlike dungeons or gates, it was an unexpected disaster that allowed monsters to seep into the human world. They took to the streets of cities and killed civilians. This rift was huge, and all the creatures that lived in other dimensions gained access to the human world. The monsters sensed that there was plenty of food waiting for them in this world and tried to take advantage of the rift to escape their dimension. Huge, monstrous wolves and kobolds crawled out of the rift and looked in surprise at the lone player standing there. Their appearance did not come as a surprise to the young man. Sang-hyun was happy to meet the monsters. Just a few minutes ago, the young man had left the underground subway station. Sang-hyun remembered from his memories of his past life that this was supposed to happen any minute now. And indeed, a glow began to appear right in the middle of the street, and it soon became clear that the rift would open right here. Sang-hyun was amazed at how clearly he remembered this situation. Of course, there was a special reason for this. That rift had turned out to be a real tragedy. Many civilians had died that time, but now Sang-hyun was in the right place, so it was safe to say that such tragedies would not happen again. Sang-hyun was happy to return to the past because now he would be able to improve people's lives at least a little. From the moment he was born, as far as he could remember, the boy grew up in an orphanage without parents. The boy didn't even remember what his mom and dad looked like. The child was not sad about this because he had a large and friendly family in the orphanage. But soon the boy realized how sad it was to lose someone. It happened just when the rift occurred and monsters destroyed his teachers and friends. It was then that Sang-hyun saw his savior, and since then he had lived with the dream of becoming just as strong. The boy's goal was to become stronger, and that seemed to be the most important thing. So now when the rift formed and monsters began to crawl out onto the streets of the city, Sang-hyun was ready and eagerly awaiting them. The young man activated the Time of the Dog and the Wolf skill, and all the monsters were intimidated, becoming very obedient. Sang-hyun was pleased with this skill. It worked perfectly. However, the effect still did not reach the level it had when the skill was used on Cerberus. Perhaps the lack of effect was due to the absence of the moon, so the wolves could not completely obey the player. But that was even better. Now Sang-hyun would be forced to fight and would be able to gain experience not only through skill. The guy now has the opportunity to test his new sword and abilities. Sang-hyun activated the full charge skill. Now, when destroying small and medium monsters, he instantly restored his health. The player did a great job swinging his sword and cutting monsters to pieces. The young man used a hidden skill. Some of the monsters were knocked off their feet and scattered, colliding with each other. Sang-hyun noted that counter-explosion had a large area of effect, and full charge increased the damage. The Time of the Dog and the Wolf skill did its job. Now all the kobolds were sitting down, beaten and miserable. In addition, the luck level increased the critical hit rate, so it was likely that the wolf-like monsters would soon fall. Sang-hyun looked at the kobolds that were still alive and realized that it was impossible to kill them with one blow. The young man decided to test the situation with 2 strikes. He raised his sword and rushed to chop up the wolves. The vehicle transporting a group of players to clear the city streets was traveling at full speed. The guys arrived at the address given by the woman who had called. One of the players jumped out of the car, introduced himself, and said he was from the association. It was a player named Lee Hyun. The woman introduced herself and said that she was the one who had called. She then pointed out where the monsters were, and the player advised her to go to a safe place. Lee Hyun didn't even have time to promise the woman that they would take care of the monsters. The players understood that they first needed to figure out what they were seeing. They witnessed a terrifying scene. A player was literally tearing apart the monsters that were trying to escape from the rift. Huge, powerful kobolds were trying to attack the guy. Li Zhong and Li Hyun realized that this was a kobold rift and began to take out their weapons and put on their armor on the run. But then they heard an unfamiliar player shout that he was fine and that the guys didn't need to intervene. The player shouted that he could handle it himself. Just then, Sang Hyun received a notification about his title upgrade. The young man wanted to see how he would deal with the monsters next. He had already used the psychedelics skill, restored his strength, and increased his speed. The kobolds could only growl. Sanyan used counter-explosion, with all his stats restored. The young man wanted to see what would happen to him now. Everything was fine with the player himself, but those around him clearly felt uncomfortable. One of the players who had come to the rift recognized the guy who was now a star on all channels, Shin Sang-hyun. Sang-hyun confirmed that it was indeed him and apologized for not introducing himself earlier. The players from the association were delighted, because this time, thanks to the guy's help, there were no casualties. And that's a real miracle for a rift like this. One of the players asked if Sang-hyun was going to enter this rift. It turned out that this is what all high-level players do. The guys asked to take them with them if Sang-hyun didn't consider this request too presumptuous. Li Zhong couldn't say he was thrilled with his friend's idea. The players promised not to interfere or get in the way. They just wanted to see how Shin Sang-hyun hunted. Sang-hyun said he wouldn't forbid them, but he thought to himself that these low-level players were just kids. Sang-hyun rushed to attack the monsters that continued to emerge from the rift, and the association players ran after him to watch. Jung didn't understand why this young man was so fast, since he was so low level. Go-hyun suggested forgetting about levels and just running and watching. Even from outside the rift, it was clear that this player had an excellent sense of combat. Hyun suggested watching closely, studying, and learning as much as possible. But Jung was not reassured. It was too strange to him that Sang-hyun had such endurance after the battle. Li Hyun had also been convinced that he had the highest stamina among players in the world. But then a very important battle took place, which revealed a lot. Just half an hour before the events described, the guys entered the rift. Once inside, they immediately realized that they had been too hasty and that it would have been better not to go in. The players immediately found themselves in a huge hall filled with many kobold-type monsters. They varied in strength and equipment. Shin Sang-hyun reacted instantly. He took cover behind the corpse of one of the monsters he had brought with him and ordered the guys to stand behind him. The kobold archers immediately began shooting, trying to harm the players from a distance. Bringing the body of a huge monster with him was a great idea. At least initially, he did a great job. Sang-hyun thought that bringing players from the association with him was a big mistake. Not only did he have to deal with monsters, but he also had to cover these players. But Sang-hyun decided to stop complaining and instead focus his strength and energy on how to deal with the situation. After all, he wouldn't get high ranks if he always only went on easy quests. The huge kobold drew his giant bow, finally ready to shoot the players. Sang-hyun threw the body of a slain monster at the beast, and while they were distracted, the young man rushed into the attack. Sang-hyun used all the necessary skills, and the kobolds' heads flew in different directions. The young man quickly dealt with the monsters on the first floor and announced that they could now move on to the second floor. But at that moment, a huge shockwave was directed at the player, and he barely managed to stay on his feet. This move came out of nowhere. The young man was glad that he managed to react in time. Otherwise, he could have been flattened. The fact was that the kobold champion had entered the arena. Of course, it was strange that someone so strong would be guarding the second floor. The kobold champion, holding up a huge shield, rushed to attack the player. He was very fast, and it became clear that the monster was recharging on the move. Sanyan didn't know if he could repel this attack with a counter-explosion. After thinking for a while, the young man decided that it wasn't worth taking a risk in an uncertain situation. This meant that he would have to reduce the overall damage level when preventing the monster's attack. Shin Sang-hyun knew he was taking a huge risk, but he didn't have time for any significant changes. He had to go all in. The young man's sword pierced the monster's shield and began to break through its defense. Sang-hyun kept up the pressure, and soon his sword pierced through the shield and reached the kobold champion. Sang-hyun didn't understand what was happening. He saw that some damage was being done, but apparently it wasn't enough to stop him. But he still managed to defeat even the kobold champion, known for its high level of defense. However, Sang-hyun did not yet think that he had already managed to gain the necessary stats. In that case, perhaps his power belonged to the two-handed battle spirit sword. Be that as it may, the ordinary kobolds were stunned when they saw the body of their champion. Sanyan finally understood how it all happened, and now he was confident again and waited for the next batch of monsters to approach him. On the second floor of the gallery, a real meat grinder was taking place. This was watched not only by the players and the associations, but even by ordinary rank-and-file kobolds. Soon, the entire floor was littered with pieces of the destroyed kobolds' bodies. Among them stood a pair of strange boots that emitted a strange glow. They turned out to be speed boots, a platinum artifact, and Sanyan immediately decided to put them on. Since kobolds were more obsessed than goblins, they had rarer artifacts. The speed boots allowed the wearer to move much faster. The boots fit perfectly, and it would be much easier to raid unexplored territories in them. Sanyan approached the railing on the second floor and began looking around for new enemies. He saw exhausted association players on the first floor who had also killed several monsters. The guys were pretty worn out and covered in blood, but they still fought much better than expected. With renewed strength, Sanhyun rushed further into the territory in search of enemies. The young man had already calculated how much money he would earn for this raid. In addition, the victory over the kobold had restored his health, which was now sufficient for many things. He could also count on receiving a new title. Sanyan soon reached a terrible aura, which meant he was about to face a strong opponent. The young man entered the Buyong Rift in the central hall of the Royal Treasury. What he saw inside would amaze anyone. Mountains of gold, coins, and every other treasure imaginable. Sang-hyun immediately realized that his bad feeling had been wrong. Now the guy understood that he would never have to work again. He thought that he would no longer try to level up and set goals. With that much money, the whole world was at his feet. However, he was not alone in this hall. At that moment, another monster was sitting in the upper gallery, who used his crossbow and shot an arrow at the player. The arrow hit the pile of treasure, and gold bars and coins flew high into the air. Sanyeon was ready for this hidden attack. As the crossbow bolt flew towards him, the young man jumped up from the other side and swung his sword. The kobold in this treasure room used the same pattern as the other kobolds. The young man struck several blows, and the monster fell from the balcony to the lower floor, into the treasury. Sanyeon noticed that his opponent was able to dodge the blow. Something new indeed. It seemed as if all these kobolds were deliberately distracting him. At that moment, it became clear that the young man had already begun his battle with the final boss, who was the king of the kobolds. The monster managed to fire a crossbow while falling, but Sang-hyun dodged the shot again, managing to jump aside. The young man activated his full charge and felt that the danger was quite close. If he hadn't dodged, he would have been hit for sure. Finally, both opponents landed on the floor of the room and now stood facing each other. San-hyung understood that victory would not come quickly and that he would have to work hard with this opponent. The king was too powerful and his crossbow looked gigantic. Chong and Hyun finally reached the entrance to the treasure room and, judging by the sounds, realized that the final battle was already underway. The guys rushed into the hall, intending to apologize for arriving so late, but a little surprise awaited them. More precisely, it was a giant surprise in the form of an enraged wolf-like monster. The players from the association were in complete shock. They had no intention of fighting the boss, and their bodies were paralyzed with fear. At that moment, Sen-hyun jumped out and found himself right above the Kobold King, raising his sword to strike. He was angry that the Kobold King had decided to pay attention to someone other than the player. The young man dealt a devastating blow to the king, but the effect did not work due to the final boss's resistance. Sang-hyun noted that he was able to resist intimidation thanks to his recovery effect, but the difference in stats did not allow him to cause staggering. Still, the young man understood that the intimidation effect was actually very powerful, judging by the appearance of the association players. After all, these guys were at the 100th level, and they couldn't even breathe normally due to the intimidation effect. It immediately became clear that the final kobold boss was much stronger than the other bosses Sang-hyun had already fought. Unfortunately, he didn't succeed this time. However, the guy was sure that he would not be intimidated, so he rushed to attack directly. The Kobold King used indiscriminate barrage fire, and shots rained down in all directions, sweeping away everything in their path. Sang-hyun used his powerful sword as a shield to prevent injury. He succeeded, but it took a lot of strength. He understood that his opponent was also intelligent. This was an unusual monster that they had never encountered before. The demon had an endless supply of arrows, kept his distance, and tried to prolong the battle by using his full charge. The intimidating effect of the Cobalt would wear off faster than the boy's recovery. If the enemy figured this out, Sang-hyun could die, unable to do anything because of the intimidation effect. This battle couldn't be drawn out too long. At that moment, the young man regretted not having any long-range attacks. By this time, the players Jung and Hyun had recovered. They had never encountered this status effect before in their practice, which is why the intimidation had such a strong effect on them. The Kobold King showered Sang-hyun with an endless stream of arrows again. Jeon and Hyun watched the attack from afar. They wondered why Sang-hyun was still okay. It was unbelievable. The guy must have had some kind of cancellation skill. Lee-hun noticed that the arrows sticking into the ground were sinking deeper and deeper. He guessed what was happening and immediately started shouting to Sang-hyun that it was a trap. At that moment, Sang-hyun was standing over a pile of gold and did not understand why his opponent had suddenly stopped shooting. As soon as the young man's foot touched the gold coins, the king of kobolds shot him again with his crossbow. The young man couldn't move because his feet had sunk into the coins like a swamp, and the arrow pierced his body clean through. The Kobold King smiled predatorily as he approached the young man, thinking he had already won. But then Sang-hyun smiled and said that the kobold wasn't the only one who could perform magic tricks. Due to the effect of the sacrifice, the frontal attacks were nullified, and the young man's health was completely restored. Sang-hyun noted that the King of Kobolds should have noticed when the young man allowed himself to be hit so easily. Now the player used the psychedelic skill. His stats were restored, and his speed was significantly increased. Sang-hyun shouted that it was the Kobold King's turn to miss his attacks and rushed into the attack. The young man also activated a counterattack explosion. As a result, a multitude of gold coins pierced the monster's body and inflicted significant damage. Jung and Hyun noted that the gold coins pierced the monster's body like shotgun pellets. It was a very powerful counterattack. But Lee Hyun, watching what was happening, said that even that was not the main thing. He had met many players, but he had never seen anyone with the same fighting spirit as this guy. The Kobold King stood in a pool of his own blood, badly battered and exhausted. Sang Hyun noted that the enemy was very persistent, but it was time to finish this battle. The young man attacked the Kobold King, and the monster could do nothing about it. Everything around him was covered in his blood. Immediately, a notification came that the Kobold King had been defeated. Sang Hyun received a new title and a level upgrade. In addition, the young man received the title of Constellation, which was also a first and very pleasant experience for him. Something else lay on the ground, and it was also alluring and attractive. It turned out to be an intimidation tactic that Sang Hyun now possessed. The Amulet of Despair allowed him to deprive his opponent of the will to fight. In addition, he received an Explorer's Necklace, which could be used to identify enemy forces, and another pair of speed boots. Sang Hyun enjoyed the gifts he had received, but then the players called him and distracted him from his favorite activity. He could barely hide his irritation at being interrupted by these two players from the association. But they warned him that they needed to leave urgently because the rift was already beginning to close. Of course, everyone knew that the rift closed as soon as it was cleared, but why was it happening so quickly? This meant that there was no time to gather all the riches of the world with them. And now mountains of gold coins and ingots, as well as chests of jewels and artifacts, lay in piles in the middle of the hall. Chan and Hyun grabbed Sang Hyun by the arms and forcibly dragged him out, while he screamed desperately that they shouldn't take him away. Outside, near the rift, reporters and ordinary civilians had gathered. People looked with admiration at their heroes, who had managed to clear everything. The rift was already closing, and there were no casualties among the civilian population. However, soon the townspeople no longer looked as happy as they had a few seconds ago. They looked at the universal hero Shin Sang-hyun and did not understand why the guy was so upset. The young man was on the verge of hysterics. Journalists from the editorial office of the Player magazine immediately rushed to the young man to greet him. Sang-hyun was now a hero to everyone, the man who saved the city, and people wanted to hear a few words from him. Shin Sang-hyun didn't understand what was going on or why they were calling him a hero. He was so upset about losing the treasure that he forgot about everything else in the world. In the city, in an advanced training hall, players were conducting training. Several B-rank golems were summoned. A player named Cho Ik-hyun had to deal with them. Soon, the start of the simulated battle was announced, and the golems rushed into attack. Shin Tae was also at this training session. The girl waited for the monsters to get closer so she could practice the necessary skill. Waiting for the right moment, she rushed in and struck with her swords. For Shin Tae, this training and such opponents were not particularly difficult. She attacked all three at once, rushing past the three goblins and inflicting cutting wounds on them. One such attack was enough to leave a pile of mangled bodies behind Terry. The training mode was too slow. Of course, it was better than nothing, but Shin Tae had come here hoping to practice her powerful attacks once again. After all, today, during a trial battle with Shin Sang-hyun, the girl felt a kind of excitement and worthy resistance. At that moment, a breaking news report began, telling about the rift that had formed at Bupyeong Station. The news reported that, fortunately, there was one player at the scene of the tragedy who was able to clear the rift single-handedly. The journalist managed to interview him, and so Shin Sang-hyun's face appeared on all the TV screens across the country, saying that he did not consider himself a hero. He just did what he had to do. The girls watched TV in complete admiration. They were delighted by his modesty, and Terry did not expect to see the guy so soon, especially under such circumstances. The reporter asked what the opponent was like, because according to the Players Association, monsters in the rifts can reach level 150, and Sang-hyun's level is significantly lower. The player replied that level is, of course, an important factor, but he believed that level alone does not determine victory or defeat. Shin Tae watched the report intently and agreed wholeheartedly with the young man. She understood that Sang-hyun was objectively assessing his own skills. The girl felt that the guy exuded maturity and experience, like a player who had gone through hell. She wanted to know who his mentor was. Besides, his constellation could well be the god of war or someone even worse. Sang-hyun could have signed a contract with the divine place, as Shin Tae had done in his time. The next day in his apartment, Sang-hyun laid out the artifacts he had received in front of him, preparing to consume them. The young man had entered a space without consciousness, and now had to receive delicious food instead of weapons. Sang-hyun was very pleased that it was finally time to eat. He sorted through the artifacts he had received the day before. Intimidation, the Explorer's Necklace, a step back. Every artifact was useful, probably all thanks to his luck status. So far, everything was going great. If this continues, the player will grow exactly as they want, because since the era of players began, most of the cool guys have looked very powerful. Swordmasters couldn't escape the stereotypical influence of strength or endurance, but when monsters with different attack options began to appear, those who sought only brute force were destroyed. Swordmasters gradually began to lose ground, or at least that was the impression. But soon, a player named Do Kyung-soo appeared. He was a sword demon, and he had a completely different appearance. Then the paradigm of sword masters began to change. Players shed their heavy armor to maximize maneuverability. The sword demon compensated for his lack of defense with evasive maneuvers and adopted all useful skills. In other words, he was a sword master ready for any situation. One could even say that Do Kyung-soo became the pioneer of the all-around sword master style. Sang-hyun understood that in his past life, it was pride that prevented him from changing his fighting style, which is why his life was the way it was. But now the young man decided to behave differently. He prepared to absorb the speedsters, the amulet of despair, and the explorer's necklace. Delicious dishes were provided in exchange for the artifacts. The young man was very pleased, and his mouth watered at the sight of such food. It's good when you can be not just a glutton, but also a gourmet. Sanyeon noticed that he had received only 2 dishes, even though he had given away 3 artifacts. It wasn't that he was afraid of going hungry, but he still needed to make sure that none of the artifacts had been overlooked. The very next day, the young man's life changed dramatically, starting with the fact that he was now driving a different car. Sang-hyun, of course, wanted to spend the money he had earned on purchasing artifacts, but even driving the new car was different. The player had to go to Bupyeong Station because the city authorities had decided to install a plaque there in honor of the liberation and cleansing of the rift. The young man did not want such attention at all. While driving, the phone rang. The association manager said that the young man was going on a raid to the Silent Land, and he absolutely had to be there. The manager also added that the raid would take place today, and the young man confirmed that he was already on his way. The manager of the Players Association also said that another member of the company would accompany him there. Sanyeon thought about how quickly time was flying by. He had been focused solely on training to test his progress, but it had already been a week since the young man had cleared the rift. The young man replied that he was looking forward to trying out his new skill. Suddenly, he saw that there was some kind of traffic jam on the road. Part of the roadway was cordoned off, and a traffic controller was standing in the middle of the intersection. There shouldn't have been any traffic jams at this time of day, and the young man didn't understand what was going on. Sanyong had deliberately left during off-peak hours, but now it was clear that the journey would take forever. It was completely unclear why there was suddenly such a traffic jam. Could another rift have opened? He saw the gate, a huge number of television crews, and players being interviewed by journalists. One of the players standing in the middle of the street giving an interview was none other than the sword demon Do Kyung-soo. Sang-hyun was speechless with surprise. This was the idol of his entire past life, as well as the idol of absolutely all swordsmen in the country. The entrance to the dungeon was right in the middle of the intersection, so most of the nearby streets were blocked, causing a lot of traffic jams. In addition, fans who dreamed of loving Kyung-soo, having many children with him, and all the other pleasant things gathered there. The reporter told the player that he was still incredibly popular. Even though he didn't often appear at cleanups, the girl wanted to know how he felt when so many people loved him. Do Kyung-soo said that he felt a great honor and responsibility towards everyone. Of course, the journalist wanted a more detailed answer instead of this dry one, but it was immediately clear that the player's head was spinning from popularity. The next questions were related to the upcoming raid. When asked what his strategy was, Do Kyung-soo replied that it was the same as always. The player added only that his goal was to exterminate monsters, and that was all. The journalist looked at the player with adoring eyes. She had already forgiven his taciturnity, considering it a very attractive trait. At that moment, the player who was with Do Kyung-soo suggested that his friend look to the side. Following the player's gaze, it became clear that he had spotted a new star among the players, who was trying to get there in his car and was stuck in traffic. Those present noticed that it was Shin Sang-hyun. Immediately, there was talk of jealousy and espionage. Sang-hyun was so distracted by the road that he did not notice that his fans had spotted him. Journalists immediately began to blow up the story. What will happen now? An unexpected meeting of 2 legends. After all, the young Sang-hyun has every chance of replacing Do Kyung-soo. The players said that this newcomer had cleared the rift single-handedly. They also said that his sword style was very similar to Do Kyung-soo's. The sword demon himself said that he was aware of all these details and smiled as he looked at the young man. Journalists began to ask why Sang-hyun had come here, but the young man replied that it was just a coincidence. He was stuck in traffic and ended up in this place. The journalists speculated that perhaps the newcomer wanted to challenge Do Kyung-soo himself. The young man was clearly embarrassed. He had no intention of attracting the attention of the sword demon at that moment. Sang-hyun didn't know how to fix the situation and get out of the unpleasant predicament he found himself in. Do Kyung-soo himself looked at the young man and smiled as he looked at him. Sang-hyun noticed this look, but couldn't understand what it was. Just a smile or a smirk? Sang-hyun did not answer the journalist's questions. He tried to analyze the situation, but was glad to see that smile on the player's face. He looked at his idol and realized that he still had a lot to learn. Do Kyung-soo didn't say anything to the young man, but told his friend that it was time to leave. Do Kyung-soo didn't say anything out loud, but he thought that he had already met many promising players. But this newcomer was special. Shin Sang-hyun did not look at his idol with admiration, as all the other players did. Shin Sang-hyun looked at him as someone he intended to surpass in the near future. Without waiting for his assistant, Kyung-soo headed for the gate, trying to remember Shin Sang-hyun's name. The player was sure they would meet again. Finally, the young man reached the dungeon called Silent Land. Shin Sang-hyun was still under the impression of the unexpected meeting. Do Kyung-soo seemed somehow unreal, even though he was just standing there and doing nothing else. Sang-hyun understood that he still had a lot of work to do. But the harder it is to get a reward, the more valuable it is. The young man was sure that he would catch up with his idol. At that moment, a noise caught his attention. Several players were shouting that today was their turn to storm the Silent Land. They didn't understand why Shin Sang-hyun was going there, and they weren't. Sang-hyun approached the players and asked what was going on. The manager didn't have time to explain the situation to him. An unfamiliar girl rushed at the young man with accusations, saying that he had gone too far, taking advantage of his sudden popularity. After all players, without exception, must observe basic standards of decency. Sang-hyun listened to the girl and suddenly remembered her face. Until recently, the young man had not been sure, because his memories had become increasingly blurred over time. He remembered that it was on this very day that his friend's sister was supposed to die, and now she was standing in front of him, shouting. Sang-hyun would never have thought that such different people could be related, because she was the complete opposite of her brother. The girl continued to yell, and Sang-hyun decided that there was no point in holding back in this situation. He wasn't going to make excuses to her. He looked down at her and realized that sometimes you have to be firm with people. Sang-hyun said that even if the girl was upset, she shouldn't take it out on him, because the player was following the association's orders, and it wasn't his fault. After these words, Sang-hyun turned around and headed straight for the basement, saying that he had no time to waste on unnecessary conversations. The scandalous girl continued to scream and struggle, saying that she would not let the situation go unnoticed, and that the guy had better be on his guard. Finally, Shin Sang-hyun entered the Silent Land. It was the territory of an abandoned city, covered in mud and swamp. On top of everything else, a powerful rotten smell immediately hit the player's nose as soon as he entered. Of course, this was to be expected. Sang-hyun had only taken a few steps when he suddenly felt the ground beneath his feet crack, and suddenly long arms reached out to him, tearing through the asphalt. Soon, a toothy monster, very similar to a living dead man, began to crawl out after the arms. Sang-hyun wanted to draw his sword, but it turned out that he was under a silence effect due to the ghoul's attack. The young man would not be able to use his skills for a second. Of course, it was a minor delay, and the guy instantly cut the ghoul in half. But immediately, identical monsters began to crawl out of the asphalt, and they were everywhere. Sang-hyun analyzed the situation and realized that they had sensed him as soon as he entered the territory. In addition, the monsters immediately restricted the use of skills without even receiving any blows from the guy. A multitude of hands reached out to the player. The young man analyzed the battle, realizing that everything here would be based on fundamental principles, and if there was one thing he was sure of, it was that. A meeting was taking place in the strategic meeting room of the scout team of the Korean branch of the Players Association. The meeting was led by a female manager who showed the attendees the players they needed to discuss urgently. The next such player was a rookie named Shin Sang-hyun. Many of those present immediately recognized this popular guy, who was well liked by many and made a good impression. Even those who did not usually follow newcomers had already heard that only a month had passed since his awakening, and he was already working on tough cleanups. Some of the attendees looked at the guy with interest. They had already heard about his unusual skills, for example, during the clearing of rifts. Indeed, lately, it was this guy who had attracted everyone's attention. His rapid growth was unmatched by other players. However, he should not be considered something special. There was no point in comparing him to such famous players as Kim Mi-so and Do Kyung-soo. After all, there have always been players with excellent growth rates. Of course, his independent actions during the clearing of the rift deserved high praise. But at this point, the association was unable to determine how dangerous the situation in the rift really was. Perhaps he was simply very skilled at manipulating the media, and all the hype surrounding the player was exaggerated. An argument had already begun among the meeting participants because not everyone was impressed by the newcomer, the imposter, and the media personality. Lee Ga-hee took the floor, apologized for interrupting the speakers, and continued. Lee Ga-hee said that she personally follows the career of a player named Shin Sang-hyun. She had gathered all the information about the player over the past few days. It took her some time to find out everything, but she recommended that the others do the same. This was the only way to understand and make sure that Shin Sang-hyun was not an ordinary player. The girl began to show the slides she had prepared in advance. Everyone knows how ordinary players develop. The association sets parameters for level 50, assuming that any player will soon reach it. But in Shin Sang-hyun's case, the graph took a completely different path. The player developed very rapidly, which was significantly different from all ordinary players of his level. Those present claimed that this was impossible, and they could not verify or believe it. Indeed, they had to conduct such research themselves. Some even suggested that Lee Ga-hee had lost the ability to determine the skill level of the player she was assigned to check. Of course, it is possible to view a certain number of skills, but when receiving information, certain thoughts come to mind. When viewing the number of titles and at such a pace, Shin Sang-hyun matched the growth rate of the sword demon, Do Kyung-soo. This was the conclusion that Lee Ga-hee came to after checking the objective data. Moreover, the girl found absolutely no refutation of this. She spoke with all of Shin Sang-hyun's former dungeon partners, whom he had managed to visit during this period. When asked if Shin Sang-hyun had any peculiarities, Captain Yoon replied that he had too many. Lee Ga-hee clarified that she was referring to his combat skills, intuition, and presence on the battlefield. Captain Lee replied that Sang-hyun's skills were exceptional. He had never met anyone who could use them like that. And that was far from the only thing. The captain guessed that there was a special reason for this. It was precisely because of this reason that Shin Sang-hyun had become such a special player. Captain Yoon would say that it was all thanks to the young man's natural combat instincts. Lee Ga-hee asked what the players thought of Shin Sang-hyun's fighting instincts and was told that his basic skills were incredibly impressive. Lee Ga-hee tried to find out who the players compared Sang-hyun to in order to consider him so incredibly cool, but the guy said that it wasn't just that. If that were the case, they wouldn't be here. It was very difficult to explain, but Shin Sang-hyun stood out from the rest with his excellent and well-trained technique. Fighting alongside him, it felt like you were next to a veteran with years of experience behind him. Lee Ga-hee was very interested in this detail and wanted to hear more. The players replied that it seemed as if the young man already knew what was going to happen in the near future. His intuition about what his opponent would do next was simply amazing. At that very moment, Sang-hyun was fighting the walking dead in the abandoned zone. Of course, everyone has moments of weakness. The same was true for Shin Sang-hyun. But if a player doesn't have enough experience to compensate for this, they are bound to get one or more injuries. So, I want to point out that Shin Sang-hyun was completely different. This did not apply to him. It seemed as if his body moved on its own, even before he had time to think. At that very moment, Sang-hyun continued to cut the walking dead into pieces. One of the monsters opened its huge toothy mouth, preparing to bite the young man. But the guy had excellent combat instincts, and this feeling was well trained. It didn't matter what game situation he was in, he always found a way out. There was no doubt or worry that he would die, or that any of his skills would not be used as intended. Lee Ga-hee summed up all of the above and said that Shin Sang-hyun's distinguishing feature was his instinct, which rivaled foresight. To this, we must add his sensory perception of the game, which was comparable to that of A+ level players. If we analyze all of this, we can consider this young man to be an S-class player. At that very moment, all the walking dead in that area were finished off. There were too many of these stupid walking monsters, but such is the life of a player clearing dungeons. One of the representatives of the Players Association, after listening to the analysis, literally fell into hysterics, saying that it was impossible to believe. The girl probably doesn't understand what it means to be a K-rank player. Besides, this is nonsense about foresight. It turned out that Sang-hyun knew about the rift in advance and went there to earn the title. Lee Ga-hee confirmed that the idea of returning to the past or regression was quite an interesting story. At that moment, the head of the association intervened in the scandal. He ordered everyone to be quiet and said that he understood why Shin Sang-hyun was considered an unusual player. The captain instructed Lee Ga-hee to continue observing this unusual newcomer and to do so in complete solitude. Lee Ga-hee was very pleased with this assignment and promised to do everything in her power. Sang-hyun moved further into the abandoned city. Everything around him was still gloomy and ominous. The young man hated the smell of monster blood, but the smell of ghoul blood was even worse. They appeared suddenly, had to be dealt with, and didn't drop any artifacts. Sanyeon stopped in his tracks, suddenly remembering something. He grabbed his head because he realized that he didn't have the skill necessary to pass through the territory. But then his eyes lit up with an ominous yellow glow, and he said that he should have used this skill from the very beginning. He was talking about the detection skill. Now looking ahead, Sang-hyun could clearly see the scale of the task ahead. He could see all the ghouls hiding. Of course, this did not make him very happy because there were a lot of monsters, but the guy still hoped that he had already dealt with at least half of them. But suddenly the player's attention was drawn to a monster approaching him from afar. It was a fly. It was unclear why it was considered a monster, but the detection skill counted it as such. The next moment, everything became clear. The fly exploded with a very powerful blast. Sanyeon was thrown a considerable distance. His clothes and hands were damaged and the fly committed suicide. Fortunately, Sang-hyun reacted in time and did not suffer any burns. But if he had been a fraction of a second slower, the player could have lost his arm. What a terrible place, if even flies commit suicide. Most likely there is a magic-type monster somewhere nearby. In addition, the number of enemies was increasing rapidly, and it became clear that if they weren't dealt with urgently, they could die. Powerful explosions rang out one after another, and someone was watching from afar. They were several walking dead who were sending suicide bombers. At that moment, the association meeting was as heated as the battlefield. The deputy commander continued to criticize the newcomer, because apart from her combat instincts, the girl had not been assessed for any skills or titles. Based on the table, Shin Sang-hyun had unique means of acquiring most skills. Lee Ga-hee confirmed that she had also noticed this fact. The living dead watched with interest as Shin Sang-hyun fought. The player created a protective aura around himself, and all the exploding flies could not harm him. Sang-hyun stood in the center of the protective circle and waited for the flies to leave him alone. When the next batch of flies exploded, the young man said it was now his turn to attack. A few days ago, he spent a considerable amount of time in the underground training room of the City of Players. There, he had deflected numerous arrows flying at him from all directions. It had only been 3 days since the young man began honing this skill, not counting special cases such as devouring artifacts. The only way to acquire a fairly simple skill is through constant training. If a player uses widely known guides, they acquire basic skills. But to master special skills like full charging, such methods usually don't work. So constant practice in special conditions is required. Players who discover such methods usually keep them secret to make themselves unique, so it is almost impossible to obtain them by accident. And now, standing in the epicenter of the explosions, Shin Sang-hyun thought about this. The young man was still a very experienced player, so using a protective circle at this stage could help him. The Walking Dead were extremely dissatisfied to see that their flies were no longer having the desired effect. They decided to add some kind of magical power to the flies and activated it. Sang-hyun already had a rough idea of where the attack was coming from. He looked at the main opponent sending in a multitude of suicide flies. The protective circle that the player had tried so hard to obtain was good for defense, but its main drawback was its limited forward mobility. Another batch of flies produced powerful explosions that devastated the area, which was already not particularly cozy or comfortable. The Walking Dead continued to watch the exploding flies when suddenly the player appeared right above their heads. Sanyan already understood that virtually any limitation could always be circumvented. His opponents, taken by surprise, began to urgently activate their defensive capabilities. These Walking Dead activated the Inferno spell. But it turned out that this action was too late. Sanyan managed to apply his skills so that the spell had no effect. A few swings of his sword resulted in the Walking Dead mages being chopped into separate bones. The final boss of the territory watched the outcome of this battle with surprise and amazement. He did not expect his weaker subordinates to lose so quickly and perish as if they were a holy trinity. A large, luxurious lilac magic crystal appeared at the site of their death. Sang-hyun happily picked up the purple mana crystal, delighted that he had finally gotten some high-level loot. High-level items were worth a lot of money because the rewards in difficult dungeons were very substantial. Sang-hyun wanted to take the crystal, but decided to pick it up after completely clearing the dungeon. The young man activated his detection skill again and decided to go into the thick of battle. Thanks to this skill, all enemies were detected. But then some surprising new information came in. It turned out that there was only one villain left in the entire dungeon. All the other monsters had disappeared somewhere, and this one monster, which was still not clearly visible, was nearby. It was right behind the player, and there was no time to react. Sanyan didn't know where the blow would come from, but he knew he had to instinctively sense the situation and predict the direction of the attack. In the end, the guy jumped straight up, leaving his opponent facing empty space. And it was a great move. In the next moment, the ground cracked and began to collapse. Sang-hyun knew it was madness, but now he was falling down along with the rocks and earth. He guessed that the monsters hadn't disappeared anywhere. In fact, all the ghouls in the area had hidden because a guy had appeared who was scary even to them. It was a monster that indiscriminately exterminated not only players, but also other monsters, the Death Knight. And now this monster was approaching the player, raising his fist and preparing to strike. Sang-hyun didn't understand why this enemy, who was supposed to be deep in the dungeon, had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. When the young man had last encountered it face to face, it had become clear why the outcome had been tragic. It was the Knight of Death who had killed his friend's sister in his previous life. The monster gave no explanation and tried to attack the player with all his strength and power. It turned out to be a mid-level boss named the Knight of Death of Wrath and Repentance. But Sang-hyun was confident that he would destroy him in this life. The opponents clashed swords, and their blows sent everything around them flying as if from an explosion. Each blow from the Death Knight was deadly and could destroy anyone at any moment. The Death Knight, as his name suggested, belonged to the Walking Dead type of monsters. He was born of death itself. To be precise, the Death Knight was the soul of a sword master trapped in a restless body. His main technique was the constantly active skill, Total Silence. The skill silenced anyone who touched the black ore of his feet. The Players Association assumed that he could be defeated by a level A player using the dungeon monster, Gulya, as a standard. The association simply raised the difficulty of the Silent Land dungeon to level 120. And that was the association's biggest mistake, because the true power of the Death Knight was not the swamp of silence at all, but the spirit of the Sword Master residing within. If this Sword Master was extremely strong, the Death Knight became even more dangerous. Later, the Players Association adjusted the danger level of the Silent Land dungeon. Much later, it became clear that the Death Knight was here, posing a threat of level A+ or even S. And now the young man was forced to fight such an opponent. At first glance, it seemed like a losing situation. It was indeed very dangerous. This time, Sang-hyun truly felt that he might not be able to cope. The Death Knight approached the young man, who lay motionless on his back, thinking he was dying. The whole situation was extremely dangerous, but Sang-hyun had no intention of dying here and now. The young man got to his feet, leaning on his sword, getting upset every time thoughts of imminent death reappeared in his head. It should be noted that people do not change quickly, and weak thoughts of panic always arise first when things start to smell like they're about to burn. From this point of view, Shin Sang-hyun had not changed at all since he was a player in his past life. But now he got to his feet and turned to his opponent. Sang-hyun said that there was no point in staring at him. It was better to come closer and meet his death. The Death Knight expected the player to show some kind of reaction, especially given his pitiful state. The Knight of Death was starting to get angry, but he didn't attack yet, giving the player time to recover. Soon, however, he launched an attack. unable to tolerate the insult. It was an excellent move because Sang-hyun's health had not yet recovered, and he was unable to fight. The guy realized that he needed to restore his health somehow, so he activated his scanning skill. Sang-hyun discovered monsters hiding from the Death Knight and immediately ran towards them. This suited the guy very well. While the Death Knight was not around, all the monsters moved to the center to avoid battle. Sang-hyun ran into one of the rooms, dragging his pursuer behind him. The entire hall was full of ghoul-like walking dead. He was quite capable of dealing with them, and Sang-hyun began cutting the monsters with his sword, waiting for the Death Knight to catch up. Soon, the Death Knight also reached the room. By this time, Sang-hyun had already destroyed a number of monsters and restored his health. The young man activated the Smart Hunter rank, which increased his stamina and fully restored his health. All this was accomplished more quickly thanks to the artifact. He had to stay focused and continue restoring his health while the Death Knight was busy with the ghoul. Slicing through monsters in his path, the young man headed to the deepest part of the dungeon. There a huge number of similar monsters awaited him. Of course, this could be considered a problem, but in this case, the monsters were working to restore the player's health. The Death Knight followed behind him, also killing monsters. The Death Knight burst into the room and swung his sword, cutting all the ghouls in half. Sang-hyun barely managed to avoid being injured. It was very dangerous, and the guy realized how lucky he was. Besides, this attack was clearly not aimed at him. This meant that the Death Knight was not entirely stupid. He wanted to deprive the player of his source of recovery. He guessed that Sang-hyun was restoring his health and killed all his allies. The next blow was aimed at Sang-hyun, and he barely managed to dodge it. Waiting for the right moment, the young man decided that he had recovered enough and found an opportunity to attack. He swung for a counterattack. But then something unexpected happened. Sang-hyun's skills disappeared. The young man was flying through the air, but now his sword was terribly heavy and he couldn't even strike a blow. It turned out that there was a swamp of silence near the Death Knight, which deactivated all skills. The Death Knight took advantage of the situation and attacked the player. Sang-hyun couldn't fight back and simply fell, unable to hold on. His health was at a minimum, the stupidest mistake the young man had made many times before, and he was sure he wouldn't make it again. All his restored health was gone. Sang-hyun would have died if he hadn't used his sword block. Even in such a tragic situation, Sang-hyun thought that he couldn't give up again. Once in this very place, his partner had died in his arms. Before dying, his partner turned to his friend and asked him to fulfill one request. He wanted to be buried next to his sister. The area had been almost cleared, and the rescue team was expected to arrive soon. His partner was sure that Sang-hyun would survive and hoped that he would fulfill his request. And now Shin Sang-hyun was one step away from death, and the Night of Death stood before him. Shin Sang-hyun began to say that he had been thinking about this situation for a long time, and it really was wrong. It was entirely his fault. The player had tried to save his stamina for the final round. He had been wrong then, but now he would not repeat his mistakes. Sang-hyun was back on his feet and ready to fight. After all, this battle was not for life, but for death. The young man activated the psychedelic skill and was about to put an end to it. Sang-hyun understood that he couldn't end it right here, not because of his attachment to the goal or the past, but because the situation required concentration. The player moved toward his opponent with absolute confidence. The opponents rushed to attack each other, using all kinds of tricks. The players rushed around the entire area, striking blows and trying to avoid counterattacks. Sang-hyun understood that he was very weak compared to the knight, because a single scratch was enough to peel the skin off his palm. Therefore, it would be very easy to kill the player, but it was impossible to defeat the Knight of Death by force. But now the young man saw that he was superior to his opponent. He managed to run up behind him and prevailed in speed and sharpness of attacks. Sang-hyun shouted to his opponent that his attacks were useless if the Death Knight could not block them. The young man activated the critical strike effect, which was directly linked to the player's luck stat. The probability of a critical hit was at its maximum. The goddess of luck was very favorable to her protege. And now the young man watched as the Death Knight fell to the ground and began to bleed. Sang-hyun still felt the immense strength, power, and anger that literally boiled inside him. The player shouted at the Death Knight to stop pretending and get up. Of course, it was too early to think that the fight was over or that the enemy had been defeated. The Death Knight began to rise using the flames of his past life as a sacrifice. All of his physical stats were increased. Sang-hyun seemed to have anticipated this turn of events and noted that the real battle had only just begun. All Death Knights had different skill levels, but they still had something in common. When a Death Knight's health dropped to a critical level, a self-destruct function was automatically activated, and a standard deadly game of tag began. Sure enough, the Death Knight soon found himself safe and sound, radiating power throughout the dungeon. With his current health level, even a single blow from such an opponent could be fatal to the player. Attempting to kill him now would be tantamount to suicide. In such a situation, the young man had no choice but to play the role of a victim, as if a rabbit had appeared before a huge and bloodthirsty lion. Sang-hyun couldn't allow himself to simply be eaten, because even a victim fights for its life until the very end. The final countdown began, and in 10 seconds, the Death Knight would self-destruct. However, he had to hold on for those seconds. How long they seemed. Sang-hyun decided to flee and ran like never before in his life. The Death Knight pursued him closely, keeping up with him. The The seconds ticked away, and the Death Knight also activated a magic skill. He threw his sword at the player, trying to hit him from a distance. Sang-hyun deflected the sword flying towards him. The seconds stretched out like hours and sometimes like days. The Death Knight approached, reaching out his bony hand toward the young man. The seconds ticked by, and it seemed that there were very few left, but there were still too many. Sang-hyun felt his body literally screaming in pain. His lungs were turning inside out and unable to function. He rushed forward, not caring about the road, realizing that his life depended on it. The young man begged his body to hold on just a little longer. Seconds continued to tick away, and soon the player found himself on the ground, completely exhausted, while the Death Knight approached his victim. Sang-hyun was once again under the influence of the Swamp of Silence effect, and all his skills were deactivated. The only thing he could do was think. If the guy didn't figure out what to do now, there would be no one left to think later. Sang-hyun remembered how he had recently cut monsters like ghouls to pieces with his sword. He stood over the bodies of the slain monsters and felt pretty good about himself. Sang-hyun was glad to be rid of those stinking creatures. He leaned on his sword, tired but happy. His partner approached him and said that it was all over, and Sang-hyun confirmed that he had also just killed the last one. His partner was surprised and noted that the dungeon wasn't as difficult as they had expected. Of course, one could disagree and say that they had been fighting non-stop for an hour and were very tired. His partner said that this was precisely why he had asked Sang-hyun to bring the artifact that had been given to him for unusual stat restoration. At first glance, it seemed completely pointless, and the skill was useless. But the partner explained that you just had to know how to use it wisely. Even if it was unfair, the player could only use the skill once and try his luck. It was better to do so based on the situation he found himself in. After all, this is what distinguishes a good player. Everyone has problems. But for true professionals, they happen extremely rarely, so a one-time skill is enough for them. Sang-hyun thought that soon he would have a companion whom he would also mentor and train. But now the player used a recovery skill, which was canceled due to the status effect Silence. The guy retreated and used a step back. This active movement skill allowed him to move backward quickly. If the enemy wasn't expecting it, it could create a great advantage. The clock continued to tick. The Death Knight saw his opponent again and had no intention of dying alone. Sang-hyun thought about what an unpleasant type his opponent was. The young man had used up his last mana on the step back. He had nothing left to play with and could do nothing. The Night of Death was approaching, the clock was ticking, and Sang-hyun continued to retreat. The clock was ticking, the night was advancing, and Sang-hyun felt like he couldn't move a finger. He wanted to know how much time was left. The clock ticked. The Death Knight rushed into the attack. Sang-hyun had time to think that this might be the last thing he would see before he died. It was unclear at what point everything had gone wrong. Most likely, one mistake followed another. Sang-hyun had apparently underestimated the enemy's strength from the very beginning and suffered enormous damage. But even after that, the player continued to make the same mistakes. The Death Knight was getting closer. The clock was ticking. The Death Knight's hand was almost within reach of the player. The clock was ticking. The hand was just a few inches from his face, but Sang-hyun still fought to the very end. Although, of course, this life could have been lived better. How he didn't want to die, the hand was getting closer. Sang-hyun lay on his back, his face illuminated by some kind of light, and the young man began to laugh out loud. The Death Knight's hand gradually disappeared. The player had already mentally buried himself. Time was up. The Death Knight let out a final cry, and the player felt that his third life had begun. A notification informed him that Sang-hyun had defeated the Death Knight, increased his levels, and fully restored his health. In addition, the player received a huge amount of experience that was previously unavailable to him. The player's level increased significantly, as the full restoration of health after leveling up had an immediate effect. But that's not all. Health and stamina are two different things. His health was restored, but his stamina was excessively high. In addition, the rollback after using the psychedelic skill continued to work, but there was no need to rush. Ahead of him lay a battle with the final boss of the Silent Land, who would be even more difficult to defeat. The guy understood that it was impossible to continue like this. He had only one option left. The only thing he could do now. Sang-hyun canceled psychedelic, endured the painful backlash, and restored his stamina faster. The player thought that he hadn't landed any impressive blows with psychedelic, so perhaps the recoil would be easier. However, painful sensations still tore through the guy's body. After canceling psychedelic, the player entered a state of complete helplessness from all the accumulated damage. He had to suffer through everything that had previously seemed completely painless. A notification appeared stating that the accumulated damage had exceeded the threshold value. Exhaustion of the body was recorded. Such prolonged exhaustion could lead to the player's death. Near the entrance to the dungeon, they eagerly awaited the player's exit. It was very strange. The female manager had already received a preliminary analysis from the association. Sang-hyun should have already cleared the dungeon and returned. But something had clearly happened inside, and now the players didn't know what to do. Maybe they should report it to the association or not let him go alone at all. Of course, their conscience was bothering them, but at the same time, this guy had clearly pissed off the beauty, and she didn't want to feel sorry for him. Of course, it was unclear what was happening inside. The Silent Land territory remained truly silent. Shin Sang-hyun lay on the ground, showing no signs of life. Who knows how this whole story will end? Maybe this is the end, or maybe it's just a pause before the next equally interesting events.